It began with footsteps, not a single march, not a single column, but countless footsteps across deserts, beaches, mountains, forests, and cobblestone streets. The 1st Infantry Division carried its legacy long before the Second World War ever tore the world open. Its soldiers walked with the weight of earlier battles at their backs, their insignia a single red numeral that meant far more than its shape suggested. The Big Red One was never just a unit, it was a lineage, a story passed from one generation of soldiers to the next, carried in mud, sand, sweat, and memory. When the world erupted in the early 1940s, the 1st Infantry Division answered with a calm certainty, as if they had known their role long before the moment arrived. They trained on windswept fields beneath grey skies, boots grinding into frozen earth, rifles slung across shoulders that were already heavy with expectation. They learnt to march until time blurred. They learnt to shoot until instinct replaced thought. They learnt to endure because endurance was the quiet promise of the Big Red One to stand, to stay, to hold, even when the world demanded too much. The desert met them first. North Africa unfolded beneath a boiling sun, the air shimmering with heat, sand stretching to horizons that felt endless. Wind swept dunes into shifting shapes. Vehicles sputtered, engines clogged with dust. Water became a treasure. Sleep came in short, broken pieces beneath stars that glittered coldly above a world burning below. The fighting was chaotic, armor duels across open plains, infantry scrambling for cover among rocks and scrub, artillery echoing across barren distances that swallowed sound. The Big Red One adapted quickly. They learnt the rhythm of desert war, slow mornings, violent afternoons, nights filled with exhaustion and silence. They learned to trust the man beside them more than the ground beneath them. They learned that survival was a mosaic of instinct, discipline, and luck. Then came Sicily, with its rugged hills and cliffs rising like jagged teeth from the coastline. The land fought them as fiercely as the enemy. Heat pressed down with a different weight here, humid, ancient, filled with the scent of dust and olive groves. Villages clung to ridgelines. Roads wound upward in tight coils. Each step felt like walking inside a furnace. But the 1st Infantry Division climbed regardless, pushing through ambushes, clinging to rocky cover, moving from one ridgeline to the next in battles where sweat and dust mixed until uniforms felt like armor made of sand. Then the sea carried them to the place that would carve their name into history with unforgiving precision. Omaha Beach. The morning air was thick with mist and dread. The horizon blurred into grey. The water churned beneath landing craft packed with men who knew what waited but could not imagine the scale. When the ramps dropped, the world exploded, machine gun fire stitching the surface of the water, mortars crashing into sand, bodies falling, waves pulling at gear, and uniforms heavy with seawater. For many, the surf became a grave. For others, the beach became a world of chaos and desperation. But the Big Red One pressed forward, crawling, stumbling, dragging themselves across sand that felt endless. They pushed into the bluffs, into fire that felt inescapable, into history that demanded more from them than any training could have prepared them for. Omaha was not won in minutes. It was won in inches. After Normandy, the 1st Infantry Division pushed through France, through hedgerows that turned every field into a maze, through villages scarred by artillery, through roads littered with the remnants of retreating forces, rain-soaked uniforms, mud clung to boots. Exhaustion settled into bones like a permanent resident, but they kept moving because the Big Red One did not stop. Not for weather, not for terrain, not for fear. They pushed through Belgium, through Germany, through battles fought in forests where sunlight barely touched the ground, through streets shattered by years of conflict, through the final miles of a war that felt endless. The Big Red One saw the worst of the fighting. They saw the first triumphs, the deepest losses, the hardest miles. They saw liberation and devastation intertwined. They saw what humanity could be and what it could become. Tonight, we return to their journey, to the dust of North Africa rising behind their boots, to the cliffs of Sicily echoing with the sound of gunfire, to the cold surf of Omaha dragging at their legs, to the forests of Europe swallowing their footsteps, to a lineage built not on glory but on endurance, the quiet, unbreakable endurance of men who refuse to fall back. Before we drift deeper into their story, I want to ask you something gentle, something personal. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what hour rests softly around you? Is it early enough that the world is still awake, or late enough that everything feels slower, quieter, gentler? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the Big Red One moved through the hardest landscapes because someone always said, we keep going. In your own life, has there been a moment when you kept going simply because something inside you whispered that you had more strength than you realized? And if these long, drifting journeys into the past help your breath slow, your shoulders soften, and your eyes grow heavy, consider subscribing. June 6th, 2019, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. An elderly man in his mid-90s steps onto the sand where he nearly died 75 years earlier. His hand trembles as it touches the beach. The wind catches his jacket, revealing a distinctive patch on his shoulder, a red numeral 1 against an olive background, the Big Red One. Around him, camera crews document the anniversary, but he doesn't notice them. His eyes scan the bluffs where German machine guns once turned the surf crimson. He remembers the screaming. He remembers friends who never made it past the waterline. He remembers being 20 years old and certain he would die before noon. But what brought him to this beach in 1944 began not in World War II, but in another war, another generation, and another terrible test that forged the identity his division would carry into history's greatest conflict. May 1917, Fort J, New York Harbor. Regular Army soldiers, professionals who had enlisted for careers, not conscripts, dragged into service, received orders that would change American military history. The United States had declared war on Germany just weeks earlier, and the nation needed an expeditionary force immediately. These men, drawn from existing regular army units scattered across American posts, would form the skeleton of America's 1st Division, organized for combat in Europe. They came from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, 7th, and 28th Infantry Regiments, consolidated into a new formation. They were the best America had, career soldiers who knew their trade. Unlike the civilian armies being raised through conscription, the War Department designated them the 1st Expeditionary Division, a name that would soon be shortened to simply the 1st Division. They had no idea they were creating a legacy that would outlast all of them, that would send their grandchildren to the same shores they were about to storm, that would make their unit designation synonymous with sacrifice itself. By October 23rd, 1917, these American soldiers stood in French trenches near the Artois sector, facing an enemy that had been refining the art of industrial slaughter for 3 years. The Germans were veterans of Verdun, the Somme, the nightmare battles that had consumed millions. The Americans were untested, uncertain, and aware that Europe's armies considered them amateurs playing at war. At precisely 6:05 in the morning, a German raiding party struck the American positions. Sergeant Alexander Arch of F Company, 16th Infantry, fired back. It was the first shot fired by an American soldier in World War I. The distinction meant nothing to Arch. In that moment he was trying not to die, but it established the pattern that would define his division. First to fight, first into every desperate situation, first to bleed. The Germans withdrew after a sharp firefight, leaving behind casualties. The Americans had passed their initial test, but they had no conception of what was coming. The Western Front did not offer tests. It offered only attrition, a meat grinder that would consume men faster than nations could replace them. The real crucible came July 18th, 1918, at Soissons. The German spring offensive had shattered Allied lines, driving to within 40 miles of Paris. The French were exhausted, the British depleted, and the Americans represented the only significant reserve of fresh troops. The 1st Division, now commanded by Major General Charles Summerall, received orders to spearhead a counter-offensive aimed at cutting the Soissons-Château-Thierry road, the main supply line for the German salient. There was no time for reconnaissance, no time for detailed planning. The attack would begin at dawn, and the division would advance through heavily defended terrain against veteran German troops who understood that losing this position meant losing the war. The night before the assault, soldiers wrote letters home, knowing many would never be mailed. They checked their rifles, fixed bayonets, and waited for the whistles that would send them forward. Some prayed, some slept, some stared into darkness and wondered why they had volunteered for this. The assault shattered against German defences like a wave against stone, except this wave was made of men. Within the first hour, entire companies ceased to exist as organised units. Machine gun fire from concrete bunkers scythed through advancing infantry. German artillery pre-sighted on likely approach routes, dropped shells with devastating precision. Officers who stood to lead their men forward died instantly, cut down before they could give orders. Sergeants who took command fell moments later, corporals found themselves leading platoons, privates leading squads. The division advanced anyway, not through superior tactics or brilliant leadership, but through sheer, relentless pressure. When one wave was destroyed, another came forward. When that wave fell, another followed. The Germans had never faced this kind of attack, not suicidal charges like the early war, but methodical, grinding pressure that never relented. By the end of the first day, the 1st Division had advanced 5 miles. By the end of the second day, they had cut the Soissons Road. By the time they were pulled from the line, 5 days later, they had suffered 7,000 casualties, 1/4 of the division's strength, but they had broken the German offensive's back. The cost of being first became brutally clear as the war continued. While other American divisions rotated in and out of combat, receiving rest periods and time to absorb replacements, the 1st Division remained in the line. Commanders knew they could rely on these troops, so they used them repeatedly. At Saint-Mihiel in September 1918, the 1st Division led the assault that eliminated the German salient. At the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest battle in American military history, the 1st Division again spearheaded the attack, advancing through the Argonne forest against German positions that had been fortified for 4 years. The division spent 180 consecutive days in active combat, a record no other American division approached. By the armistice on November 11th, 1918, the 1st Division had suffered 23,538 casualties killed, wounded, missing, captured. No other American division came close to this butcher's bill. No other division had been asked to do as much, to fight as long, to sacrifice as completely. But something unexpected emerged from this horror. The survivors, and there were survivors, men who had endured every major American battle of the war, developed an identity that transcended normal unit cohesion. They had proven themselves against Germany's best troops and won. They had taken casualties that would have shattered lesser formations and kept fighting. They had earned respect from French and British allies who initially dismissed Americans as naive novices. When the division marched into Germany as part of the occupation force, leading the American army across the Rhine, they walked with the confidence of men who had done the impossible. Other divisions might have fought well, other divisions might have shown courage, but the 1st Division had been first in everything that mattered, first to fight, first to bleed, first to prove that American soldiers could match European veterans blow for blow. This pride, this identity as the tip of the American spear, became the division's defining characteristic. The Big Red 1 shoulder patch told the story in simple geometry. Approved by the War Department in June 1918, it was designed to be distinctive and easily recognizable essential qualities when identification might mean the difference between friendly fire and coordinated action. The red numeral 1 on an olive drab shield was straightforward, almost austere. No elaborate symbolism, no classical references, just a statement of fact. We are first. The simplicity was deceptive. That patch would come to represent not just a designation, but a tradition, a burden, and eventually a curse. Men who wore it in later wars would feel the weight of those World War I casualties, the expectation that 1st Division soldiers would succeed where others failed, would accept missions others couldn't accomplish, would pay costs others wouldn't bear. In 1918, it was merely a patch. By 1945, it would be soaked in so much blood that the red numeral seemed less like a choice of colour and more like inevitability. When the Great War ended and the division returned to America, parades and celebrations couldn't mask the questions that survivors carried home. They had done their duty, proven their courage, and won their war. But at what cost? Some soldiers had survived despite being wounded multiple times. Others carried injuries that would cripple them for life. Still others, perhaps the majority, bore psychological scars that 1918 America had no language to describe and no treatment to offer. They had shell shock, they had nightmares, they had moments when a car backfiring sent them diving for cover. They couldn't explain to families what they had seen, couldn't make civilians understand what it meant to advance over the bodies of friends, couldn't reconcile the cheerful, patriotic songs with the screaming chaos they remembered. So they stayed quiet, found jobs, tried to build normal lives. The division remained active in the army's peacetime structure, but it would spend the next 2 decades as a shadow of its wartime self, sustained mainly by the memory of what it had accomplished and the determination of a few career soldiers who refused to let that memory die. By June 2019, when that elderly veteran stood on Omaha Beach, only a handful of World War I veterans remained alive, and none could make the journey to France. The last survivors of the division's World War I service had passed into history, taking their first-hand memories with them. But their legacy lived on in the man touching the sand, in the patch on his shoulder, in the weight of expectation that had carried through 21 years of peace and into an even greater war. He had landed on this beach in 1944, wearing the same patch his predecessors had worn at Soissons. He had carried the same burden: be first, fight harder, accept no excuses. He had survived when so many hadn't, and now he stood as a living link between two generations of sacrifice. The tourists and journalists around him couldn't fully understand what he represented. They saw an old man at a memorial. He felt the presence of every soldier who had worn the big red one and never grown old, who had given everything so that the division's tradition of being first could continue. It was honour, it was privilege. It was the cruelest possible burden. And it began in the mud of France in 1917, when young Americans learned that being first meant being expendable, that excellence earned not rest but more desperate missions, and that glory was another word for casualties that someone else's son would be asked to match a generation later. 1922, Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, New York. A sergeant major walked through barracks that once housed hundreds, now echoing with emptiness. Bunks stood stripped of mattresses, footlockers gathered dust, and the only sounds were his boots on wooden floors and whined through broken window panes. 4 years earlier, this post had been packed with soldiers preparing for war. Now, the 1st Infantry Division, the Army's most decorated combat formation, numbered barely 3,500 men, less than 13% of its wartime strength. The sergeant major had fought at Soissons and the Meuse-Argonne. He had watched friends die to prove American soldiers could fight. Now he oversaw training for recruits who joined not from patriotism but from desperation, in an army the nation wanted to forget. The world had changed, the division had not, and the gap between what it once was and what it had become represented everything wrong with America's peacetime military. The Army's collapse after World War I was swift and brutal. Wartime strength peaked at 4 million men in November 1918. By 1922, Congress had cut the army to 137,000, smaller than Portugal's army, smaller than Romania's. The 1st Division survived mainly because it was regular army rather than National Guard or temporary wartime formation, but survival was a hollow victory. Each of its 3 infantry regiments, the 16th, 18th, and 26th, maintained skeleton staffs but couldn't field full battalions. The artillery brigade had guns but no horses to pull them, then had neither guns nor horses. Support units existed on paper only, training budgets disappeared. Ammunition for live fire exercises became so scarce that soldiers trained with wooden rifles and simulated machine guns that made sounds instead of firing bullets. Officers who had commanded battalions in France now commanded companies, or left the service entirely for civilian careers that actually paid a living wage. The men who stayed did so for reasons that had nothing to do with military glory. The depression that began with the stock market crash of October 1929 made even the Army's meagre pay attractive. Recruiting officers in New York, Chicago, and Detroit saw lines of men willing to enlist for 3 meals a day and a place to sleep. These were not the professional soldiers of 1917, career men who chose military service as a calling. These were factory workers who lost jobs, farmers who lost land, young men who saw no future in civilian life. They were often undereducated, sometimes undernourished, occasionally criminal fugitives who joined to escape prosecution. The old sergeants, World War I veterans, who remembered when the 1st Division meant something, tried to train them to the old standards, tried to instill the pride that came from being part of America's premier combat formation. But it was hard to feel elite when you were drilling with broomsticks because the real rifles were locked in the armory to prevent wear and tear. Equipment stagnation told the story of institutional neglect. The rifles the division trained with were Springfield Model 1903s, the same bolt-action rifles American soldiers had carried in World War I. They were excellent weapons for 1918, obsolete by 1938. While Germany developed semi-automatic rifles, while other nations experimented with submachine guns and light machine guns for squad-level firepower, the 1st Division trained with weapons designed before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. Artillery pieces were equally dated French 75s acquired during the World War, or American 3-inch guns from the same era. Tanks were rare and ancient, left over from wartime production. Trucks were civilian vehicles impressed into service. breaking down constantly. Communication equipment was wire-based, requiring linesmen to string cable under fire, a system World War I had already proven inadequate. When officers conducted tactical exercises, they had to imagine the equipment they would need in actual combat because that equipment didn't exist. The tactical doctrine the division followed was even more outdated than the equipment. Field manuals from the 1920s emphasized open warfare, the kind of mobile combat that supposedly ended the trench stalemate of 1918. This doctrine assumed future wars would involve clear front lines, organized advances, and symmetric forces fighting according to accepted rules. It had no answer for the combined arms warfare Germany was developing, the coordination of armor, infantry, and aircraft that would define the Second World War. When Spain erupted in civil war in 1936, providing a testing ground for new military technologies and tactics, American officers had to read about German and Soviet innovations in newspapers because the army couldn't afford to send observers. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and demonstrated what modern warfare actually looked like, the 1st Division was training to fight a war that had ended 20 years earlier with equipment that was obsolete before most of its current soldiers were born. Yet the division clung to its World War I identity with desperate intensity. Every year, on November 11th, Armistice Day, the division held ceremonies commemorating its Great War service. Veterans who had survived Soissons gave speeches to recruits who had been toddlers when that battle was fought. Unit histories were compiled and distributed, emphasizing the division's firsts: first to fire, first to attack, first to enter Germany. The Big Red 1 patch was sacred, a visible reminder that whatever the division's current condition, it had once been America's finest combat formation. This emphasis on history served a purpose beyond nostalgia. It provided continuity when everything else was changing, gave soldiers something to take pride in when their current circumstances offered little, but it also created a dangerous disconnect. The division was preparing to fight Germany based on lessons learned, fighting Germany a generation earlier, and Germany had learnt from that defeat in ways America had not learnt from that victory. The professional officer corps that sustained the division through these years deserves recognition for persistence bordering on obsession. Men like then Major Clarence Huebner, who had enlisted as a private before World War I and earned a battlefield commission in France, stayed with the division through the lean years. They knew the defense budget wasn't coming back, knew Congress and the American public wanted nothing to do with European wars, knew their own careers would stagnate as the army stagnated. They stayed anyway, preserving institutional knowledge, maintaining standards, preparing for a war they hoped would never come but suspected was inevitable. These officers conducted endless tactical exercises with imaginary equipment, wrote and rewrote operations plans for scenarios they had no resources to implement, and trained soldiers they knew were inadequate for modern combat. It was professional dedication that looked like madness, maintaining a fighting force without the means to fight, sustaining combat readiness without resources for combat. The 1938 Munich crisis provided a brutal reality check. When Hitler demanded the Sudetenland and Britain and France chose appeasement, American military planners conducted assessments of US readiness for war. The conclusions were devastating. The entire army could field perhaps 5 divisions ready for combat, and ready was generous. The 1st Division, supposedly the army's most capable formation, lacked trucks to move itself, ammunition for sustained combat, modern anti-tank weapons, effective anti-aircraft guns, and adequate communication equipment. A realistic war game in 1939 concluded that the division would be combat ineffective within 2 weeks of meeting a modern enemy force. The army ranked 17th in the world by size, behind nations like Poland and Turkey. When war erupted in Europe in September 1939, American officers watched German armored divisions destroy Poland in 27 days and realized with sick certainty that the 1st Infantry Division, the proud, historic Big Red 1, would be slaughtered if it faced Wehrmacht forces under current conditions. The fall of France in June 1940 transformed American defense policy overnight. When the French army, considered one of the world's best, collapsed in 6 weeks, Congress suddenly discovered resources it had claimed didn't exist. Defense appropriations multiplied by orders of magnitude. The Selective Service Act of September 1940 began drafting civilians. Equipment orders flooded defense contractors. The 1st Division received expansion orders, authorization to grow from its peacetime skeleton to full combat strength. But throwing money and men at the problem couldn't solve it instantly. The division's regular army cadre of 8,000 professional soldiers would be diluted by 16,000 draftees. New weapons took time to manufacture. Training programs had to be developed for men who had never fired a rifle. Officer and NCO schools needed to produce leaders faster than quality control could guarantee competence. The division that would eventually land at Omaha Beach was being created in these frantic months, assembled from inadequate parts according to improvised plans to meet a threat that was already conquering Europe. By December 7th, 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the 1st Infantry Division had grown to nearly full strength and was stationed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, conducting training that at least used real ammunition and actual weapons. The Springfield rifles had been replaced by M1 Garand's semi-automatic rifles that gave American infantry a firepower advantage. New artillery pieces, based on modern designs rather than World War I holdovers, were arriving. Half-tracks and trucks gave the division mobility. The men were physically fit, reasonably well trained in basic infantry skills, and motivated by anger over Pearl Harbor. They looked like a combat-ready division, but appearances were deceiving. Most had been in uniform less than 18 months. Few had fired their weapons outside of controlled range conditions. None had experienced combat. The officers and NCOs who would lead them, a mix of World War I veterans, career professionals, and newly promoted men who had themselves just learned what they were trying to teach, were doing their best with what they had. It would have to be enough, because America was at war, and the 1st Infantry Division would be among the first committed to combat. Again, always first. The tradition demanded it, even if the reality suggested it was madness to send such an untested force against veteran German troops who had conquered most of Europe. But tested or not, ready or not, the Big Red One was going to war. November 16th, 1940, Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The first draftees arrived in buses, civilian clothes rumpled from overnight travel, carrying cardboard suitcases and paper bags containing everything they owned. Regular army sergeants lined them up in the cold, barking orders in a language these young men didn't yet understand. Get on line meant form a straight row. At ease meant stop fidgeting. Police the area meant pick up trash, though it sounded like law enforcement. One sergeant, a World War I veteran with campaign ribbons faded from 2 decades of wear, looked at the motley collection of civilians and muttered to his lieutenant that they were trying to make soldiers out of shopkeepers. The lieutenant, himself only 2 years out of West Point, couldn't disagree. These men represented America's industrial workforce: mechanics, clerks, farmers, factory workers pulled from civilian life by lottery. The Selective Service Act had made them soldiers by law. The 1st Infantry Division had 4 months to make them soldiers. In fact, it was nowhere near enough time. The collision between regular army culture and civilian draftee culture was immediate and bitter. Career soldiers who had voluntarily enlisted, who had chosen military life as a profession, could not comprehend men who viewed service as an unwanted interruption. To the regulars, military discipline was natural. You saluted officers because chain of command mattered. You kept equipment clean because your life might depend on it. You followed orders because mission success required absolute obedience. To the draftees, these requirements seemed arbitrary and often stupid. Why shine boots that would get muddy on the next march? Why make beds with hospital corners when they'd be unmade in 12 hours? Why salute a lieutenant who was younger and less educated than many of the men he commanded? The generational divide made it worse. Many regular army NCOs were in their 40s, having joined before World War I. Most draftees were in their early 20s, raised during the Depression, skeptical of authority, and resentful of institutions that had failed their families. Training became a daily negotiation between standards that couldn't be lowered and resistance that wouldn't be broken through traditional discipline alone. Major General Donald Kasserine, who took command of the division in November 1940, faced the unenviable task of transforming this hybrid force into a combat-ready division. Kasserine was Old Army West Point class of 1909, combat experience in World War I, decades of peacetime service maintaining readiness on starvation budgets. He understood that the draftees weren't deficient, just different. They needed to understand why military procedures mattered, not simply be ordered to comply. Kasserine instituted training programs that emphasized practical skills over parade ground perfection. Marksmanship training expanded because a soldier who could shoot felt competent. Tactical exercises increased because draftees who understood how infantry tactics worked could see why discipline mattered. Physical fitness became central because exhausted men couldn't debate whether the next march was necessary. Slowly, grudgingly, the two cultures began to merge. The regulars learned that educated draftees could master complex tasks quickly if given reasons. The draftees learned that apparently arbitrary rules often had life-saving purposes. It wasn't harmony, there was too much mutual suspicion for that, but it was functional. The Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941 revealed how far the division still had to go. 400,000 troops from across the army converged on Louisiana and East Texas for the largest military exercises in U.S. history. The 1st Division, proud of its elite status, expected to dominate. Instead, they were embarrassed. The 2nd Armored Division, commanded by then Major General George Patton, ran circles around 1st Division infantry, demonstrating that tanks could exploit breakthroughs faster than foot soldiers could respond. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and the limited air support available collapsed repeatedly. Communication systems failed under field conditions. Supply lines tangled. Units got lost in Louisiana's pine forests and swamps. After 2 weeks of exercises, umpires declared the 1st Division defeated in most scenarios. The assessment was humiliating but invaluable. Officers realized that World War I tactics, set-piece attacks with massed infantry advancing behind artillery barrages, were obsolete. Modern war required flexibility, decentralized decision-making, and integration of different combat arms. The division had 6 months to learn these lessons before deployment. In a real war, they'd have to learn under fire. Equipment finally caught up with expansion through 1941. The M1 Garand rifle, which had languished in limited production through the 1930s, now flowed to units in sufficient numbers to equip every infantryman. This mattered more than civilians realized. The Garand was semi-automatic, firing as fast as the trigger could be pulled, with an 8-round clip. German infantry still relied primarily on bolt-action rifles, requiring manual operation between shots. In firefights, American squads could put out twice the volume of fire. New artillery pieces, 105mm howitzers, replaced World War I-era guns, offering greater range and accuracy. Half-tracks provided infantry with mobility and some armor protection. Mortars, bazookas, and other support weapons that had barely existed in the peacetime army arrived in training units. For the first time since World War I, the 1st Division had modern equipment in meaningful quantities. But equipment only mattered if soldiers knew how to use it, and training time was running out. December 7th, 1941, changed everything. When news of Pearl Harbor reached Fort Devens, the division was conducting routine Sunday activities, some men at chapel, others writing letters home, many sleeping late after Saturday night passes. Within hours, leaves were cancelled, security increased, and training schedules accelerated. The theoretical war the division had been preparing for became an actual war the division would fight. The mood shifted dramatically. Draftees who had grumbled about military discipline now understood they would face combat. Regular army sergeants who had trained for careers they thought might never see battle realized they were going to war again, and many were afraid in ways they couldn't show. Officers worked through the night, updating training schedules, knowing that every day of preparation might save lives in combat. The division's next 6 months would be a race. Could they reach combat readiness before deployment? Because deployment was coming. America needed troops in action, and the 1st Infantry Division, by tradition and designation, would be among the first sent. Training intensified to a pace that bordered on dangerous. Live fire exercises, where soldiers maneuvered under actual machine gun fire and artillery, became routine. Casualties from training accidents increased, men shot by friendly fire, injured by explosive mishaps, broken bones from forced marches, but commanders accepted the risk because combat would be worse. Amphibious landing training began, with the division boarding Navy vessels in Chesapeake Bay and practicing beach assaults. The first attempts were disasters. Soldiers became seasick before reaching shore. Landing craft beached in wrong locations. Communications between ships and ground forces failed. Equipment got waterlogged. It took dozens of rehearsals before the basics became routine. And even then, everyone knew that rehearsals with blank ammunition and no enemy shooting back bore little resemblance to actual combat. But they were running out of time. By March 1942, orders came down. The 1st Infantry Division would deploy to Europe within months. Major General Terry Delameza Allen's arrival in March 1942 brought exactly the kind of leadership the division needed, though nobody recognized it initially. Allen was 53, old for a division commander by World War II standards. He had graduated near the bottom of his West Point class, spent years in career limbo, and was known more for maverick behavior than professional excellence. He drank too much, ignored regulations he considered stupid, and had nearly been court-martialed multiple times. But he understood soldiers, particularly citizen soldiers who needed to be led rather than commanded. Allen moved through camps talking to enlisted men, asking about their concerns, explaining why training mattered in language they understood. He backed his officers when they showed initiative, even if their methods were unorthodox. He told the division they were the best combat formation in the army, a lie at that point, but one he would make true through sheer force of will. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, junior son of the former president, complimented Allen perfectly. Roosevelt was physically frail, partially blind, and chronically ill, but possessed unlimited courage and understood how to inspire men. Together, they transformed the 1st Division's culture from one of cautious professionalism to aggressive confidence. By August 1942, when the division boarded trains and ships for deployment, they were as ready as 2 years could make them. They had received more training than most divisions would get, better equipment than early war conditions usually allowed, and leadership that understood both their strengths and limitations. But ready was relative. Most had never fired a shot in anger. None had experienced the chaos of combat, where plans collapsed within minutes, and survival depended on instinct and training, so ingrained it became automatic. Officers carried manuals they'd studied but never applied. NCOs knew tactics from exercises but not from battle. The equipment worked on training ranges but hadn't been tested under combat stress. They were sailing toward North Africa, where veteran German troops had spent 18 months learning desert warfare through trial and error. The 1st Infantry Division would get one chance to apply everything they'd learned. There would be no practice runs, no do-overs, no opportunity to revise the training schedule. They would land on hostile shores, face soldiers who had conquered France, and discover whether 2 years of preparation were enough. The division's World War I veterans, those few aging sergeants who remembered Soissons, watched the young men board ships and knew what was coming. Some of these soldiers would die brave. Some would die confused. Many would die before they had a chance to learn what combat actually required. But they were going anyway, because America was at war, and the 1st Infantry Division was always first to fight. November 8th, 1942, 0300 hours, Gulf of Azu, Algeria. Landing craft engines cut through darkness as the 1st Infantry Division approached hostile shores for the first time since World War I. Inside the boats, soldiers hunched against spray, weapons held overhead to keep them dry, faces reflecting nothing but concentration on not vomiting. Most had been seasick for hours. The pre-landing meal, steak and eggs, meant to be morale-boosting, had been a cruel joke once the Atlantic swells hit. Now they approached the coast of North Africa, where Vichy French forces waited with orders to resist invasion. Intelligence suggested light opposition. Intelligence was often wrong. One soldier later recalled that the worst moment wasn't fearing death, but fearing he would die without ever firing his weapon, killed while helpless in a boat by an enemy he couldn't see. The ramps dropped at 0400 hours, men splashed into surf, and for the first time in this war, American soldiers fired weapons in anger. The irony of Operation Torch, America's entry into the ground war, was that the enemy was supposed to be an ally. Vichy France, the collaborationist government that had emerged after Germany's conquest, controlled French North Africa. Allied planners hoped Vichy forces would recognize the invasion as liberation and offer token resistance before switching sides. This was politically naive and militarily dangerous. French colonial troops in Algeria and Morocco had equipment, training, and orders to defend their territory. When the 1st Division's landing craft approached Azu, French gunners opened fire. It wasn't devastating fire. Many French soldiers deliberately aimed high, not wanting to kill Americans, but it was real. Bullets cracked overhead, artillery shells threw up, water spouts. Men died in the surf, killed by soldiers who would be fighting alongside them within days. The moral clarity that had motivated men at Pearl Harbor evaporated in the confusion. Were they at war with France? Would the French surrender or fight to the death? Nobody knew. The landing devolved into chaos. By noon on November 8th, the division had secured Azu and was moving on Oran, the operation's primary objective. French resistance varied wildly. Some units fought fiercely, others surrendered immediately, still others simply disappeared into the countryside. Tank destroyer units fired their first shots in combat, knocking out French armor with 75mm guns. Infantry cleared buildings using tactics practiced at Fort Devens, discovering that real combat felt nothing like training. Buildings that were supposed to be clear harbored snipers. Streets that reconnaissance reported empty hid machine gun positions. Friendly fire became a persistent problem, units shooting at each other because identification was difficult in urban combat. By November 11th, Oran fell, and French forces agreed to a ceasefire. The 1st Division had won its first battle of World War II, but calling it a victory felt wrong. They had fought people who should have been friends, taken casualties from confusion as much as enemy action, and learned that combat was primarily composed of uncertainty and mistakes. The romantic notions about warfare that training couldn't quite eliminate died in Oran streets. The move into Tunisia through December and January revealed new enemies and new miseries. German forces under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had terrorized British forces for 2 years, now faced Americans for the first time. Rommel was not impressed. He considered American troops brave but poorly led, their tactics predictable, their coordination between infantry and armor inadequate. He was right. The 1st Division spent December and January learning lessons the British had learned in 1940 and 1941, lessons about desert warfare that no amount of Louisiana training could replicate. Water was scarce, heat extreme, sand everywhere, infiltrating weapons and vehicles and bodies. The division discovered that their olive drab uniforms were wrong for desert camouflage. Their tactics for infantry-tank cooperation, derived from European manuals, didn't work in open desert terrain. Their intelligence about German capabilities was fatally outdated. German Mark IV tanks outgunned American Shermans. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, used in anti-tank roles, destroyed American armor at ranges beyond effective return fire. The division was learning, but learning cost lives. February 14th and 15th, 1943, Kasserine Pass. The disaster began with intelligence failures. American commanders didn't believe German armor could attack through mountain passes in strength. When Rommel launched a counteroffensive with elements of the 21st Panzer Division and 10th Panzer Division, American forces were unprepared and poorly positioned. The 1st Division's 1st and 3rd Battalions, 16th Infantry, held positions near Kasserine when German armor broke through. What followed was not battle, but massacre. German tanks overran American positions, capturing or killing men before they could organize coherent defense. Artillery fire fell with devastating accuracy. Luftwaffe aircraft strafed American trucks and supply columns. By February 16th, American forces were in full retreat, abandoning equipment, leaving wounded, fleeing in disorder. The 1st Division lost 300 men killed, 300 captured, countless wounded. It was the worst defeat American forces had suffered in the war to date. For soldiers who had been told they were elite, who wore the big red one patch with pride, Kasserine was humiliation beyond description. But the division learned from Kasserine in ways that would save lives later. Officers realized that aggressive confidence without tactical skill was suicide. German combined arms tactics, coordinating tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power, were years ahead of American doctrine, and catching up required humility. Terry Allen pushed for intensive retraining even while the division remained in contact with enemy forces. Infantry learned to dig deeper foxholes because survival meant being below ground level. Anti-tank units learned to wait for flank shots rather than engaging German armor frontally. Artillery forward observers learned to call fire more quickly and accurately. Communication procedures were revised to reduce friendly fire incidents. The changes were often simple, spacing vehicles further apart to reduce losses from air attack, camouflaging positions more effectively, establishing better supply procedures, but collectively they meant the difference between competence and catastrophe. Kasserine had been catastrophe. The division had one chance to prove it could be competent. March 17th through 23rd, 1943, Guettar, German forces attempting to prevent Allied link-up between forces advancing from west and east through the 10th Panzer Division against American positions near Guettar. This time, the 1st Division was ready. Infantry had dug in properly, creating defensive positions in depth. Anti-tank guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery had pre-sighted likely approach routes. When German armor attacked, American guns destroyed tank after tank. Panzer crews, accustomed to facing British forces that retreated under pressure, discovered Americans who held their ground and fought back effectively. The battle lasted 6 days. German forces lost 30 tanks, destroyed took heavy casualties, and withdrew. The 1st Division held its positions, vindicated after Kasserine. The victory was tactically significant but psychologically essential. Soldiers who had doubted themselves after defeat now knew they could face veteran German forces and win. Officers who had questioned American tactics saw that doctrine worked when properly applied. Terry Allen's aggressive leadership, which some had criticized as reckless, proved effective when channeled through proper tactical execution. By May 1943, when German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered, the 1st Infantry Division had been transformed by 7 months of combat. The untested force that landed at Arzew had become a veteran formation that understood modern warfare's realities. They had learned that individual courage mattered less than small unit cohesion. They had discovered that overwhelming firepower could compensate for tactical errors. They had accepted that combat was primarily chaos, and success came from reducing chaos through discipline and training. The cost had been significant, over 2,000 casualties, including hundreds dead, but the education was invaluable. Other American divisions arriving in theatre would learn the same lessons the 1st Division had learned, but they would learn from 1st Division veterans who could teach them rather than learning from German veterans who were trying to kill them. The division prepared for the next operation, invasion of Sicily, with confidence they had earned rather than assumed. But that confidence carried a hidden danger. The division was good now, perhaps the best American infantry division in theatre, which meant they would be used for the hardest missions, the most dangerous operations, the places where other divisions might fail. Being good meant being expendable in a different way. They had survived North Africa. The question was whether they could survive their own competence. Terry Allen watched his division load onto ships in May, preparing for Sicily, and felt pride mixed with apprehension. The men were confident now, perhaps overconfident. They believed in themselves, believed in their abilities, believed they could handle whatever came next. Allen knew better. He had fought in World War I, had seen what happened to units that stayed in combat too long. There was a breaking point for every soldier, every unit, every institution. The 1st Division was approaching that point faster than other divisions because they fought more often in harder conditions against better enemies. Eventually, the human mind and body simply couldn't sustain the stress of combat. When that moment came, and Allen knew it would come, what happened to the division then? Could they be pulled from line, rested, rebuilt, or would institutional pride and military necessity force them to keep fighting until they shattered? Allen didn't know. But he knew that Sicily was coming, and after Sicily would be something else, and after that something else again. The division had proven it could fight. Now it would discover whether it could survive the consequences of fighting well, because in war, success was often more dangerous than failure. Failure got you sent home, success got you sent to the next impossible mission. July 10th, 1943, 02:45 hours, Gulf of Guettar, Sicily. The 1st Infantry Division approached hostile shores in darkness for the second time in 8 months, but everything about this operation was worse than North Africa. Wind whipped the sea into 6-foot swells that tossed landing craft like toys. Soldiers who thought they had conquered seasickness discovered new depths of misery. Above them, American paratroopers, who were supposed to have secured the landing zones hours earlier, were scattered across 40 miles of Sicilian countryside, many drowning in the Mediterranean after missing drop zones entirely. Naval gunfire, meant to soften German defences, had limited effect because precise targeting was impossible in darkness and rough seas. Intelligence suggested light opposition from demoralised Italian coastal troops. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, veteran German troops, was positioned inland, ready to counterattack any landing. The men of the 1st Division, clutching rifles and trying not to vomit, were sailing into a trap nobody had anticipated. The landing itself was chaos even before enemy fire began. Landing craft missed designated beaches, depositing infantry companies miles from intended positions. Units became intermingled. 1st Battalion soldiers mixed with 2nd Battalion, regiments scattered along miles of coastline. Officers tried to organize men they didn't recognize into ad hoc formations. Equipment landed in wrong locations or didn't land at all. Vehicles rolled off landing craft into water too deep, drowning engines. Communication equipment got waterlogged, leaving units unable to report positions or call for support. Dawn revealed American soldiers establishing a beachhead through sheer improvisation, following the fundamental rule of amphibious warfare: when in doubt, move inland. By 0600 hours, elements of the 16th, 18th, and 26th Infantry regiments had pushed into Guettar, a coastal town that was supposed to be secured by noon. The town was secured by mid-morning, but securing Guettar meant nothing if German armour counterattacked successfully, and German armour was coming. July 11th, 1943, 0900 hours. Tank spotters reported German armour approaching from inland Mark IV tanks from the Hermann-Göring Division, veteran crews, moving fast and shooting accurately. The 1st Division's defensive position was desperate. Most anti-tank guns hadn't made it ashore. Artillery was still being unloaded. Infantry held positions with bazookas and small arms, weapons inadequate against 50-ton tanks. The division's own Sherman tanks were mostly still aboard ships or stuck in soft sand on the beach. German tanks advanced to within 200 yards of the shore, close enough that crews could see individual American soldiers. It was the closest German forces would come to destroying an Allied amphibious landing in World War II. What saved the 1st Division was not their training, not their tactics, not their courage, though they had all three. What saved them was naval gunfire. Navy destroyers, operating in shallow water dangerously close to shore, brought 6-inch guns to bear at point-blank range by naval warfare standards. Shells that could sink enemy warships at 15,000 yards were fired at German tanks at 3,000 yards. The effect was devastating. Tanks exploded, turrets blown completely off hulls, German infantry formations disintegrated under shells designed to destroy hardened naval targets. Survivors retreated, regrouped, and attacked again. The pattern repeated through July 11th and into July 12th. German armour would advance, naval guns would devastate them, survivors would withdraw and try different approaches. The USS Boise alone fired over 400 shells in support of the 1st Division, destroying an estimated 50 German vehicles. By July 13th, German commanders recognized that attacking into naval gunfire was suicide and shifted to defensive operations. The 1st Infantry Division had held, barely, and could now expand the beachhead. But the close call revealed how dependent ground forces were on fire support. Without those destroyers, the division would have been pushed into the sea. It was a sobering lesson about limitations. The race to Palermo exposed tensions between Allied commanders and nearly destroyed the 1st Division through exhaustion. General George Patton, commanding 7th Army, saw Sicily as an opportunity for American forces to prove they could move as fast as Montgomery's British 8th Army, faster if possible. He ordered the 1st Division, along with the 2nd Armoured Division and 3rd Infantry Division, to drive west and north toward Palermo, Sicily's capital. Terry Allen understood this was partly about glory and partly about logistics, but orders were orders. The division advanced 100 miles in 72 hours, a blistering pace through mountainous terrain against scattered Italian resistance. Soldiers marched until they collapsed, were roused and marched again. Vehicles broke down from overuse. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. Men survived on adrenaline and willpower. They entered Palermo on July 22nd to cheering crowds and Patton's congratulations. Then they learned they weren't stopping. The real objective was Messina, on Sicily's northeastern tip, where German forces were evacuating to mainland Italy. The division turned east and kept marching. The battle for Troina, July 31st to August 6th, was everything Sicily wasn't supposed to be grinding. Attritional, medieval, in its brutality. The town sat atop a mountain, fortified by German paratroopers, who had no intention of retreating. Every approach was covered by machine guns and mortars. Artillery pounded American positions continuously. The 1st Division attacked repeatedly, gaining yards at a time, losing men constantly. Heat was extreme, water scarce, casualties mounting. After a week of fighting, the division finally captured Troina, only to discover German forces had already begun evacuating Sicily. The town that cost hundreds of American casualties had no strategic value. It was emblematic of the entire Sicily campaign, tactically successful, strategically questionable, personally exhausting. By mid-August, when Sicily was declared secure, the 1st Infantry Division had been in continuous combat or forced marches for 5 weeks. Casualties weren't catastrophic by North Africa standards, 2,237 with 458 killed, but cumulative exhaustion was becoming a serious problem. Soldiers needed rest. Instead, they learned they would invade Italy. The relief of Terry Allen and Theodore Roosevelt Jr. in August 1943 stunned the division. Patton and Omar Bradley, now Patton's superior as commander of 2nd Corps, met privately and decided both leaders had to go. The official reasons were vague. Concerns about discipline, Worry that Allen's aggressive leadership was too costly, belief that Roosevelt's health couldn't sustain another campaign. The real reasons were more complex. Allen had created a division in his image, proud, aggressive, contemptuous of rear echelon authority, more focused on combat effectiveness than spit and polish discipline. This made 1st Division soldiers excellent fighters but difficult to control. When not in combat, they brawled with military police, ignored regulations, and treated anyone outside the division with suspicion or hostility. Bradley, who valued order and compliance, saw this as dangerous indiscipline that would worsen under sustained operations. Allen had to go, and Roosevelt, who was fiercely loyal to Allen, had to go with him. The decision was probably correct from an institutional perspective. From the division's perspective, it was betrayal. Major General Clarence Huebner arrived as new division commander in August, bringing exactly the leadership style Bradley wanted and Allen's veterans hated. Huebner was old 1st Division. He had enlisted as a private before World War I, earned a battlefield commission in France, and spent his career with the Big Red One. He understood the division's history better than Allen ever had. But he was also a disciplinarian who believed military effectiveness began with military order. Sloppy uniforms, casual attitudes toward regulations, the rough camaraderie that Allen encouraged, all of this Huebner saw as corrosive. He immediately instituted strict uniform standards, inspections, formal protocols. Veterans who had survived North Africa and Sicily now found themselves being disciplined for minor infractions. The division fractured into Allen loyalists and Huebner supporters with predictable resentment. Training for the next operation, cross-channel invasion of France, took place in an atmosphere of internal tension that threatened to undermine combat effectiveness more than any enemy action could. By spring 1944, stationed in England and preparing for D-Day, the 1st Infantry Division had been transformed again, but this time the transformation was problematic. Huebner had systematically removed or transferred Allen loyalists from command positions, replacing them with officers who shared his vision of discipline. Old NCOs who remembered Terry Allen were pushed toward retirement or transfer. The division that would land at Omaha Beach would be technically proficient, well-trained in amphibious assault, and obedient to command. But it had lost something ineffable, the cocky confidence that came from being Allen's division, the belief that 1st Division soldiers could accomplish anything. Huebner's division was professional. Allen's division had been family. Whether professionalism was sufficient for what was coming would be tested on Norman beaches in June. The division had survived North Africa's lessons and Sicily's exhaustion. Whether it could survive the loss of its identity while simultaneously facing the largest amphibious invasion in history was an open question that nobody wanted to answer. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., meanwhile, had refused to accept relief quietly. He pulled every string available to a president's son, calling in favors, leveraging family connections, demanding another combat assignment. He was 56 years old, partially blind, walked with a cane from arthritis, and had a heart condition that should have disqualified him from service. But he was also the most decorated general officer in U.S. service who insisted on leading from the front. In May 1944, he received orders to 4th Infantry Division as Assistant Division Commander. He would land at Utah Beach on D-Day, the only general officer in the first wave. On July 12, 1944, he would die of a heart attack in Normandy, killed by the accumulated stress of 3 campaigns and a body that couldn't sustain what his spirit demanded. His funeral would be attended by soldiers from both 1st and 4th Divisions, men who had followed him in Sicily, who had landed with him in France, who understood that his death represented something about the cost of leadership that no casualty report could capture. Terry Allen would survive the war, commanding the newly formed 104th Infantry Division with the same aggressive style that had gotten him relieved. He and Huebner would never reconcile, would spend post-war years debating who had truly led the 1st Division to greatness. But in June 1944, as landing craft approached Normandy, the question wasn't about leadership styles or command philosophy. The question was whether any division, no matter how well led or trained, could survive what the Germans had prepared for them on the beaches. The 1st Infantry Division was about to find out. August 7th, 1943, Headquarters, 1st Infantry Division, Sicily. Major General Terry Della Messa Allen stood before his assembled staff and read the orders relieving him of command. His voice remained steady, professional, but men who had served with him for 18 months saw the anger and betrayal in his eyes. Allen had led the division through North Africa's disasters and victories, through Sicily's brutal campaign, had transformed a hybrid force of regulars and draftees into the most effective American infantry division in the Mediterranean theater. His reward was termination. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the assistant division commander who had earned legendary status by personally leading attacks despite chronic illness and partial blindness, was being relieved simultaneously. The official explanation, concerns about discipline and aggressive tactics, satisfied nobody. These were the commanders who had made the Big Red One work. Now they were being dismissed at the moment of victory, replaced by leaders who represented everything the division's combat veterans had learned to distrust: rear echelon authority, by the book thinking, and the kind of institutional caution that got soldiers killed. The division that afternoon divided into factions that would never fully reconcile. The decision to relieve Allen came from the highest levels of American command. General Omar Bradley, commanding 2nd Corps, and General George Patton, commanding 7th Army, had discussed Allen's leadership style repeatedly through the Sicily campaign. Bradley in particular worried that the 1st Division was becoming undisciplined to the point of ineffectiveness. When not in combat, 1st Division soldiers brawled with military police from other units. They ignored uniform regulations, believing combat veterans had earned the right to look unmilitary. They treated soldiers from other divisions with open contempt, particularly if those soldiers hadn't seen combat. Officers and NCOs encouraged this behaviour, or at least didn't discourage it, creating a division culture that valued fighting ability over military courtesy. Allen himself embodied this attitude. He drank heavily, ignored regulations he considered stupid, and made no secret of his disdain for staff officers who issued orders from safe rear areas. Bradley saw this as a cancer that would spread if not excised. He was probably right from an institutional perspective. From the soldier's perspective, he was destroying the division's soul. Major General Clarence Huebner arrived in Sicily in mid-August with orders to restore discipline. Huebner had credentials. Allen lacked. He had enlisted in the 1st Division in 1910 as a private, had earned his commission on the battlefield in World War I, had served with the Big Red One for most of his career. He understood the division's history intimately, perhaps better than anyone alive. But understanding history and understanding soldiers are different things. Huebner believed military effectiveness began with military discipline, proper uniforms, formal chains of command, adherence to regulations, regardless of combat record. His first inspections revealed problems that shocked him. Officers appeared in non-regulation uniforms, soldiers wore unauthorized patches and insignia, vehicles had slogans painted on them that would have been funny in garrison but were inappropriate for a professional military force. Huebner began issuing corrections immediately. Veterans who had survived Kasserine and Guettar, who wore their combat experience like armor, now found themselves being disciplined for dirty boots or unmade bunks. The resentment was immediate and deep. The division moved to England in November 1943 for rest and training before the cross-channel invasion. Rest never materialized. Huebner implemented intensive training regimens focused on amphibious assault, the tactic that would define D-Day. Landing exercises on English beaches occurred repeatedly, with Huebner personally observing and critiquing every detail. Soldiers learned to exit landing craft under simulated fire, to move across beach obstacles, to establish beachheads against prepared defences. The training was excellent, probably the best amphibious training any American division received, but it came with Huebner's relentless emphasis on military bearing. Between landing exercises, soldiers stood inspections where officers checked uniform conformity. Barracks underwent white-glove cleanliness inspections. Minor infractions resulted in punishment details. The division's combat veterans, who had spent months in field conditions where clean uniforms were impossible, found this emphasis on appearance insulting. The division fractured further: Allen loyalists versus Huebner's new guard, combat veterans versus recently arrived replacements who had never experienced Allen's leadership, old NCOs versus new officers who represented Huebner's vision. The systematic purge of Allen-affiliated leadership happened slowly enough that it could be disguised as normal rotation, but everyone recognized what was occurring. Battalion commanders who had served under Allen found themselves transferred to staff positions. Company commanders received reassignments to other divisions. Sergeants who had been with the division since North Africa were pushed toward retirement or given make-work positions. Officially, these were routine personnel moves to bring in fresh leadership. Unofficially, Huebner was removing anyone who might undermine his authority by constantly referencing how Allen would have done things differently. The replacements were technically competent officers from other divisions or straight from training commands, men who knew modern tactics but had never tested those tactics under fire. They came with recommendations from superior officers, with excellent records from staff schools, with all the credentials that suggested they would be effective combat leaders. What they lacked was the credibility that only combat could provide. Soldiers follow officers who they trust to keep them alive. Trust takes time to build and can be destroyed by a single bad decision in combat. Huebner was replacing proven, trusted leaders with unknowns. It was a dangerous gamble. By April 1944, the 1st Infantry Division that prepared for D-Day was technically superior to the division that had landed in Sicily. Soldiers were better trained in amphibious tactics, better equipped, more physically fit. Support units functioned smoothly. Communication procedures had been refined through endless exercises. Artillery and infantry coordination was excellent. Naval gunfire support procedures were established and rehearsed. From an institutional perspective, Huebner had created a model division, but something was missing. The old soldiers felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it. Under Allen, they had believed the 1st Division was special, that Big Red One soldiers could accomplish missions that would break other units. Under Huebner, they were professional but not exceptional, competent but not confident. The swagger was gone. Perhaps that was necessary. Swagger without competence got people killed, and Allen's division had sometimes relied on courage to compensate for tactical errors, but competence without confidence was also dangerous. Soldiers who didn't believe in their division's exceptionalism might not take the risks that victory required. They might follow orders without the initiative that turned defensive battles into offensive victories. Huebner was betting that professional competence would be sufficient for D-Day. Allen's loyalists believed he was wrong. Training exercises revealed the division's internal divisions in ways that combat couldn't. During night landing exercises in April, some units performed flawlessly, moving from landing craft to objectives with efficiency that impressed observers. Other units, particularly those with high percentages of Allen-era veterans, performed adequately but without enthusiasm, doing exactly what was required and nothing more. The difference was subtle but significant. Initiative in combat often meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Soldiers who did exactly what they were told might survive but wouldn't exploit opportunities. Officers noted this in reports but couldn't identify solutions. You couldn't order soldiers to be enthusiastic. You couldn't mandate initiative. These qualities emerged from trust and confidence, both of which had been eroded by leadership changes and the perception that combat success had been rewarded with betrayal. Huebner read the reports and pressed forward anyway. D-Day was coming. The division would perform. It had to. Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s determination to return to combat illustrated the depth of loyalty Allen had inspired. Roosevelt had been relieved alongside Allen, but unlike Allen, Roosevelt had options. He was wealthy, connected, and could have retired to a comfortable life trading on his family name. Instead, he campaigned relentlessly for another combat assignment. He wrote letters to every commander he knew, called in favors from his father's political allies, made himself a nuisance to the War Department. In April 1944, he received orders to the 4th Infantry Division as Assistant Division Commander. At 56, with arthritis so severe he walked with a cane, partially blind, and suffering from heart disease, Roosevelt was the least physically qualified general officer in the European theatre. He was also one of the most respected. Soldiers knew Roosevelt wouldn't order them anywhere, he wouldn't go first. They knew he had refused evacuation after being wounded in Sicily. They knew he led from the front, not from necessity but from character. When Roosevelt learned the 4th Division would land at Utah Beach on D-Day, he requested permission to go in with the first wave. His superiors tried to dissuade him. Generals didn't land in assault waves. Roosevelt insisted he would land at Utah Beach on June 6th. He would survive the landing. He would die 5 weeks later when his heart finally gave out. His death would devastate soldiers from multiple divisions who had served with him, who had seen him limping through artillery fire, who understood that courage came in many forms, but Roosevelt's form was particularly pure. The division Huebner commanded in June 1944 was paradoxical, simultaneously the most experienced American infantry division in Europe and the most fractured by internal tensions. The soldiers who would land at Omaha Beach brought North Africa's lessons and Sicily's experience, advantages that would save countless lives, but they also brought resentments and doubts that commanders couldn't fully address. Allen loyalists believed their beloved commander had been betrayed by careerist generals who valued compliance over victory. Huebner's supporters believed Allen had created dangerous indiscipline that would have resulted in eventual catastrophe. Both perspectives had merit. Both were incomplete. The truth was that Allen's leadership style, aggressive, personal, contemptuous of authority, had been necessary to transform an untested division into a combat-effective force. But that same leadership style made sustained operations difficult and created problems that would have worsened over time. Huebner's leadership, disciplined, professional, systematic, was necessary to prepare for the largest amphibious invasion in history. But it cost the division its unique identity, the pride that came from being Allen's soldiers. The question in June 1944 wasn't whether Huebner or Allen was right. The question was whether the division could survive landing at Omaha Beach while simultaneously processing the loss of its soul. Within weeks, that question would be answered in the most terrible way possible. The beach wouldn't care about leadership disputes or internal divisions. The beach would care only about whether soldiers followed orders, maintained cohesion under fire, and kept moving forward when every instinct said to stay down. Professional competence would be tested, combat experience would matter, and somewhere in the chaos, the ghost of Terry Allen's aggressive confidence might make the difference between establishing a beachhead and being pushed back into the sea. But nobody knew, not Huebner, not his soldiers, not even the old sergeants who had fought in 2 wars. They could only board the landing craft, approach the shores of Normandy, and discover whether 2 years of transformation from Allen's division to Huebner's division, from aggressive fighters to disciplined professionals, had prepared them for what Hitler had waiting on those cliffs. The 1st Infantry Division was about to face its greatest test. Whether the house divided could stand remained to be seen. June 6, 1944, 0600 hours, English Channel. Landing craft vehicle, personnel number 73, pitched violently in 4-foot swells, throwing men against each other in the pre-dawn darkness. 30 soldiers from Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, hunched below the gunwales, trying to keep weapons dry and stomachs settled. Most had vomited already. Some were on their 2nd or 3rd round. The pre-invasion meal, steak, eggs, toast, designed to boost morale, had been a cruel joke once the Channel swells hit. Now they approached a beach-designated Easy Red, part of a 5-mile stretch of French coastline, codenamed Omaha. Through gaps in the canvas cover, they could see other landing craft arrayed in lines stretching to the horizon. Hundreds of boats, thousands of soldiers. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. The soldier next to Private First Class Henry Martinez whispered a prayer in Spanish. Another checked his rifle for the dozenth time. The boat's coxswain, barely visible in the dim light, counted down distance, 3,000 yards, 2,000 yards. Shells from naval bombardment screamed overhead, impacting cliffs that rose beyond the beach. Smoke obscured everything. Nobody could see what waited for them. In 12 minutes, the ramp would drop. In 12 minutes, they would discover whether 2 years of training, 18 months of combat experience, and all the tactical lessons learned in North Africa and Sicily were sufficient for what the Germans had prepared. In 12 minutes, many of them would be dead. The plan for Omaha Beach assumed conditions that ceased to exist the moment combat began. Allied bombers were supposed to crater German defences with carpet bombing at dawn. Cloud cover forced bombers to delay their release, and most bombs fell inland, leaving beach defences intact. Naval gunfire was supposed to destroy concrete bunkers and gun positions. The 40-minute bombardment looked impressive but did minimal damage. Firing from ships in rough seas against targets obscured by smoke resulted in terrible accuracy. Amphibious tanks, Shermans modified with flotation skirts, were supposed to land ahead of infantry and provide fire support. 27 of 32 tanks launched for the western beaches sank in the rough seas, crews drowning before reaching shore. Infantry landing craft were supposed to beach in organised waves, units maintaining cohesion as they advanced. Strong currents pushed boats off course, mixing units, landing companies in wrong sectors. By 0630, when the first ramps dropped, every element of the invasion plan had already failed. The soldiers splashing into waist-deep water had no idea the plan had collapsed. They had orders to reach the seawall, cross the beach, climb the bluffs, and push inland. These orders presumed the enemy would be softened by bombing, suppressed by naval fire, and engaged by tanks. None of this was true. What awaited them on Omaha Beach was the most lethal defensive position Allied forces would face in the entire war. German forces defending Omaha belonged to the 352nd Infantry Division, Veterans transferred from the Eastern Front who understood defensive warfare with an expertise the Allies had not anticipated. They had spent months fortifying every inch of the beach. Concrete bunkers housed machine guns, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Attackers couldn't advance without being shot from multiple angles. Mortars were pre-sighted to drop shells on likely approach routes. Artillery on the cliffs could target the beach with devastating accuracy. Obstacles check hedgehogs, Belgian gates, log ramps turned the tidal zone into a maze designed to channelize infantry into kill zones. Mines were buried in sand and hidden among beach obstacles. Barbed wire created additional barriers. The Germans had transformed Omaha Beach into a killing field where every advantage belonged to defenders. They had clear fields of observation from elevated positions. They had protected firing positions. They had months to prepare, while attackers had minutes to react. When the first American soldiers reached the beach, German gunners simply aimed and fired. It wasn't combat in any traditional sense, it was execution. Company A, 16th Infantry, ceased to exist as an organized unit within 10 minutes of landing. Their landing craft grounded on a sandbar 200 yards from shore. The ramp dropped into 6 feet of water. Men loaded with 60 pounds of equipment tried to wade through surf while machine gun fire swept across them. Some drowned, unable to stay afloat. Some were shot before clearing the ramp. Some made it to shore only to be killed by mortar fire or mines. Captain Taylor Fellers, the company commander, was hit multiple times before reaching dry sand and died on the beach. His executive officer was killed seconds later. Platoon leaders died trying to organize their men. Sergeants who stood to give orders were cut down instantly. Within 30 minutes, Company A had taken 50% casualties without advancing beyond the waterline. The survivors, those not wounded, not pinned down, not too terrified to move, huddled behind beach obstacles or in shallow depressions, trying to make themselves small. They returned fire when possible but couldn't identify targets through smoke and chaos. German gunners, protected in concrete bunkers, could see perfectly and shot at anything that moved. This pattern repeated across the entire beach. Companies landed, died, and stopped moving. By 07:30, 2 hours before the invasion timetable said the beach should be secured, the assault was failing catastrophically. The crisis of Omaha Beach was fundamentally a crisis of leadership at the squad and platoon level, because by 0800 hours, most company and battalion commanders were casualties. Radio communications had failed, equipment waterlogged, antennas shot away, operators dead. Naval gunfire support couldn't be called effectively because forward observers couldn't communicate with ships offshore. Artillery hadn't landed because landing craft carrying guns were still circling offshore, unable to beach under heavy fire. Reinforcements were being waved off because beachmasters, soldiers responsible for traffic control were dead or missing, and nobody wanted to land more troops into what appeared to be a massacre. The soldiers on the beach faced a choice: stay where they were and eventually be killed by mortars and machine guns, or move forward into even heavier fire. Staying meant certain death, slow but inevitable. Moving meant probable death, but immediate and possibly meaningful. The decision thousands of individual soldiers made in those moments determined whether the invasion succeeded or failed. This was not about courage in the abstract. This was about men choosing between bad options because all the good options had died with their officers. Colonel George Taylor, commanding the 16th Infantry Regiment, reached the beach around 08:30 and immediately understood the situation was desperate. Men were pinned down, leaderless, taking casualties without advancing. Taylor was a World War I veteran, old enough to be the father of most soldiers around him, and he carried the authority that comes from experience and rank. He moved along the beach shouting over the gunfire, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." It was not an eloquent speech. It was barely a speech at all, but it crystallized the decision soldiers had to make. Taylor didn't promise safety or even survival. He promised only that staying meant death, while moving might mean accomplishing something before death. Soldiers began to move. Not in organized platoons, those had ceased to exist. Not in coordinated attacks, nobody could coordinate anything. But in small groups, 5 or 6 men following whoever seemed to know where they were going, advancing from cover to cover, finding gaps in the German defensive fire, using Bangalore torpedoes to blow holes through barbed wire, crawling over dead friends to reach positions where they could return fire effectively. The breakthrough, if the chaotic movements of dozens of small groups can be called a breakthrough, began around 0900 hours, when teams of infantry and engineers reached the base of the bluffs. German defences were designed to cover the beach, but had blind spots at the base of the cliffs. Once soldiers reached these positions, they were relatively safe from machine gun fire, though mortars and grenades remained threats. Bangalore, torpedoes, explosive charges on poles, designed to clear obstacles, were used to blast paths through wire and mines. Small teams began climbing the bluffs, using whatever routes they could find, ravines, defiles, anywhere that offered cover. German defenders shifted fire to cover these approaches, but the volume of fire was less intense than on the beach itself. As more American soldiers reached the bluffs and began climbing, pressure on German positions increased. Defenders had to choose between maintaining fire on the beach or protecting their flanks. American soldiers who reached the top of the bluffs found German positions from behind, attacking bunkers from directions they weren't designed to defend. Machine gun nests that had slaughtered hundreds became vulnerable when approached from their blind side. The Germans, despite their advantages, had finite manpower. As more Americans breached the bluffs, the defensive position became untenable. By noon, the character of the battle had changed from massacre to combat. American forces held positions on the bluffs, had cleared several German strongpoints, and were beginning to move inland. The beach remained under sporadic fire, but reinforcements could land with reasonable chance of survival. Casualties were staggering, estimates vary, but approximately 1,000 1st Infantry Division soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing by day's end. Some companies suffered 70% casualties. Medics worked through the afternoon and night treating wounded, performing triage under conditions that tested every principle of battlefield medicine. Bodies piled in dunes and behind obstacles would remain there for days until graves registration units could recover them. Equipment littered the waterline, rifles, packs, helmets, abandoned by soldiers who chose mobility over load. Destroyed landing craft burned at the water's edge. The beach looked like humanity's last stand against hell. But the division had established a beachhead. They held positions inland. They had survived the impossible and made it possible. The cost was terrible, the victory incomplete, but they had not been thrown back into the sea. That achievement, purchased with blood and terror, meant the invasion would succeed. The mythology that surrounds Omaha Beach, the heroism, the sacrifice, the triumph against overwhelming odds, is both true and incomplete. True, because individual soldiers displayed extraordinary courage, advancing into fire that should have pinned them down, following orders when those orders meant probable death, maintaining cohesion when their units had been shattered. True, because junior leaders, sergeants, and lieutenants, whose names appear in no history books, made decisions that saved lives and turned defeat into stalemate, into narrow victory. True, because the division's combat experience from North Africa and Sicily provided a foundation of tactical skill that less experienced divisions might have lacked. But incomplete, because the breakthrough wasn't the result of brilliant planning or superior tactics. It was desperation. The plan had failed completely. The coordination between services had collapsed. The technological advantages, air power, naval gunfire, armor support, had proven insufficient. What won Omaha Beach was the willingness of individual soldiers to make a choice between dying passively or dying actively, and to choose the latter. This wasn't heroism by design. This was heroism by necessity. And it cost more than it should have, because the plan had been inadequate, the intelligence wrong, the preparation insufficient for the reality of German defences. That night, soldiers who had survived dug foxholes inland and tried to process what they had experienced. Some cried, some stared into darkness, some wrote letters home they knew would be sanitised by censors, letters that couldn't describe the bodies in the surf, or the screaming of wounded men left on the beach because medics couldn't reach them, or the particular sound a bullet makes when it hits someone standing next to you. They had landed in France. They had survived. They had accomplished the mission. But at what cost? Looking back toward the beach, they could see fires still burning. They could hear wounded crying for help. They knew friends were dead, specific friends, men whose names they knew, whose families they had met in training, who had shared cigarettes and complaints and fear. Those friends would never leave Normandy. Their bodies would be buried in military cemeteries, marked with white crosses, commemorated in ceremonies, but they were gone. And the soldiers who survived carried a burden the dead did not, the burden of continuing to fight, of landing on more beaches, of surviving when others hadn't. June 6th, 1944 was called the longest day because of what happened in those hours. For the survivors, it was the beginning of a campaign that would last 11 months, would consume thousands more lives, would test every lesson learned, and require learning new lessons in blood. Omaha Beach was over, the war was not, and the 1st Infantry Division, having proven they could land on hostile shores and survive, would be expected to do it again and again, because that's what elite divisions did. They survived the impossible so they could attempt the impossible again. It was honor, it was duty, it was the cruelest reward success could offer. June 12, 1944, 6 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach. Private First Class Robert Garcia crouched in a ditch next to a hedgerow and tried to understand what he was seeing. The hedge looked like a thick bush, maybe 10 feet tall, sitting on top of an earthen embankment 4 feet high, dense, impenetrable, normal by Norman standards. But it was a fortress. German machine gunners positioned behind it had clear fields of fire across the adjacent field while remaining completely invisible. The earthen bank was thick enough to stop bullets, and the hedge growth on top prevented anyone from seeing through. Every field in Normandy, and there were thousands of fields, was surrounded by these hedgerows, called bocage by the French, creating a maze where visibility was measured in yards, and every field became an individual battle. Garcia had survived Omaha Beach 6 days earlier. He had thought that was the hard part. Now he realized Omaha was simple. Omaha was terrible but comprehensible. Cross the beach, climb the bluffs, neutralize bunkers. The hedgerows were different. There was no doctrine for this terrain. No manual covered it. The division's North Africa and Sicily experience meant nothing here. They were learning from scratch, and learning cost lives. The Norman hedgerows had existed for 1,000 years, created by medieval farmers who piled stones and earth at field boundaries, then planted hedges on top to contain livestock. Centuries of growth had turned these barriers into dense thickets of hawthorn, bramble, and oak, with roots that penetrated deep into earthen embankments. The result was a natural defensive system the Germans exploited perfectly. A single machine gun team could defend a field indefinitely. Infantry advancing across open ground were exposed and vulnerable. Attackers who breached one hedgerow just faced another 20 yards away. Artillery, which had been decisive in North Africa's open terrain, was less effective here. Shells exploded in treetops rather than among defenders, and the fragmented terrain made targeting difficult. American tanks, which had provided critical fire support in previous campaigns, couldn't push through hedgerows without exposing their thin belly armor to anti-tank fire. The division that had mastered North African desert warfare and Sicilian mountain combat now faced terrain that negated every tactical advantage they had developed. War became medieval small unit actions, close combat progress measured in yards per day rather than miles. The 1st Infantry Division's assignment after securing the beachhead was to advance south toward Caumont, a town whose control would give Allies a position to threaten German flanks. The distance from the coast to Caumont was roughly 15 kilometers. The division would take 3 weeks to cover that distance and would suffer 3,000 casualties doing it. Every field required its own battle. Standard American tactics: suppress enemy with artillery, advance under covering fire, flank and destroy didn't work when enemies were invisible, and terrain prevented flanking movements. New tactics emerged through experimentation and casualties. Infantry learned to advance along hedgerows rather than across fields, reducing exposure. Engineers developed methods to blast gaps through embankments using shaped charges. Coordination between infantry and armour improved as tank crews learned to provide covering fire while infantry cleared defensive positions. But these lessons came slowly and at terrible cost. Each field advanced cost casualties. Each hedgerow breached meant soldiers died learning what worked and what didn't. Combat exhaustion, what World War I called shell shock and later generations would call PTSD, became epidemic by mid-June. Soldiers who had survived North Africa, Sicily, and Omaha Beach were reaching their psychological breaking point. The continuous stress of combat, the impossibility of rest, the constant expectation of sudden violence, the accumulation of losses, all of this exceeded what human minds were designed to endure. Aid stations began seeing men who simply couldn't continue, who weren't physically wounded but were mentally shattered. Some shook uncontrollably. Some stared into space, unresponsive to questions. Some wept and couldn't stop. Medical officers faced a dilemma. These men needed evacuation and long-term treatment, but the division needed every soldier it had. Some were sent to rear areas for brief rest and then returned to their units, where they were often ineffective or endangered, others through inability to function. Others were evacuated entirely, marked as psychiatric casualties, and lived with the shame of having broken when others hadn't. The division's culture, proud, aggressive, contemptuous of weakness, made admitting psychological injury nearly impossible. Soldiers who might have sought help instead stayed in line and deteriorated further. Some became casualties through poor judgment in combat. Some survived, but carried psychological wounds that would last decades. June 28th through July 3rd, 1944, Hill 192. The hill was a minor elevation by mountaineering standards, but dominated the surrounding bocage, making it strategically valuable for artillery observation. German forces held the hill in strength and had no intention of surrendering it. The 1st Infantry Division's assault began with artillery bombardment that cratered the hilltop but didn't dislodge defenders. Infantry advanced through hedgerows, under machine gun and mortar fire, taking casualties continuously. Companies that started at 150 men ended days at 30 or 40 effectives. Platoons dissolved into squads, squads into fire teams. Leadership casualties were particularly severe. Junior officers who led from the front died at 3 times the rate of enlisted men. Sergeants who took command died the next day. By July 1st, some companies were commanded by staff sergeants, some platoons by corporals. Replacements arrived, new soldiers fresh from training, terrified and untested, and were thrown into combat immediately. Many died within days, without ever learning the names of their squad mates. After 5 days, the division captured Hill 192 and found German defenders dead at their positions from exhaustion and wounds, too depleted to retreat. Both sides had reached the edge of human endurance and slightly beyond. The division captured Villiers-Fossard on July 19th after 2 weeks of continuous combat that consumed men faster than the replacement system could provide them. Villiers-Fossard wasn't strategic, wasn't symbolic, wasn't even particularly valuable. It was just another Norman village, another objective on maps, another place where Germans decided to defend and Americans decided to attack. The battle was typical of hedgerow warfare, artillery preparation, infantry assault across fields, close quarters fighting in village streets, house-to-house clearing, casualties on both sides, eventual American victory. The pattern had become routine, which was itself horrifying. Men were dying in routine ways for routine objectives, because the strategic situation required continuous pressure on German forces. Omar Bradley's strategy, broad front advance, constant pressure, attritional warfare made sense at army level but was murder at division level. The 1st Division was grinding forward, accomplishing missions, maintaining positions. They were also being destroyed, slowly, day by day, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow. By late July, the division that had landed at Omaha Beach 6 weeks earlier was almost entirely new personnel. Most Omaha survivors were dead, wounded, or psychiatric casualties. The Big Red 1 patch remained, the unit designation continued, but the human beings who composed the division had been replaced through attrition and replacement. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, began July 25th with the most intensive aerial bombardment Allied forces had attempted. 1,500 heavy bombers and 350 medium bombers attacked a 5-mile-wide, 1.5-mile-deep rectangle south of St. Lo, attempting to obliterate German defences. The concept was sound. If air power could create a gap in German lines, armour could exploit the breakthrough and turn the hedgerow stalemate into mobile warfare. The execution was catastrophic. Bombers, approaching from the north, dropped bombs short of the target area. American forward positions were in the bomb zone. The 1st Infantry Division, positioned to advance after the bombardment, found itself being bombed by its own air force. Bombs fell among American soldiers, killing and wounding hundreds. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, highest-ranking American officer in theatre, was killed instantly by a direct hit while observing the attack. The bombing killed approximately 100 1st Division soldiers and wounded 500 more. German forces, though damaged, weren't annihilated. When infantry advanced after the bombing, they encountered intact defensive positions and fought for every yard as before. The breakout would eventually succeed, armour found weak points, German lines cracked, mobile warfare resumed. But for the 1st Infantry Division, Cobra represented one more catastrophe in a campaign that seemed designed to consume them. July 27th, the division fought through German positions at Marigny and suddenly found themselves in open country beyond the hedgerows. The breakthrough had succeeded. German forces were retreating, The hedgerow nightmare was over. Soldiers who had spent 6 weeks fighting yard by yard could hardly process that they were advancing miles per day again. The relief was overwhelming. But so was the cost assessment. The division had suffered approximately 5,500 casualties between D-Day and the breakout, killed, wounded, missing, psychiatric. Some battalions had been rebuilt twice over. Some companies were on their third set of officers. The psychological damage was harder to quantify, but equally severe. Men who had survived developed a particular kind of fatalism, not the cheerful, it won't happen to me attitude of untested soldiers, but the grim certainty that everyone got killed eventually, and survival was just a matter of delaying the inevitable. This fatalism made soldiers effective in combat. They took necessary risks because death seemed inevitable anyway, but it also made them unreachable by normal morale-building efforts. They didn't care about propaganda or pep talks or reasons for fighting. They cared about surviving the next hour, the next day, the next mission. Everything else was noise. Historians would later debate whether the hedgerow campaign was necessary or a tragic mistake, whether different tactics might have reduced casualties, whether the broad front strategy served any purpose beyond ensuring all divisions suffered equally. The soldiers who fought through the bocage had no interest in these debates. They knew what they had experienced: 6 weeks of hell where progress was invisible, casualties constant, victory meaningless because victory just meant another hedgerow to breach, another field to cross, another day of trying not to die. The hedgerows broke the 1st Infantry Division in ways that Omaha Beach hadn't, because Omaha was one terrible day while the hedgerows were 42 terrible days. You could survive one day through adrenaline and luck. Surviving 42 days required something else, something that diminished you, even as it kept you alive. The division that broke out of the hedgerows in late July was victorious but hollow, effective but exhausted, accomplished but destroyed. They had proven they could sustain combat longer than anyone expected. The question nobody wanted to answer was, how much longer could they sustain it? Because the war wasn't over. France wasn't liberated. Germany hadn't surrendered. The 1st Division had survived Omaha and the hedgerows, and their reward was that they would be sent to the next impossible mission, and the next, and the next. Because that's what happened to divisions that didn't break. They got used until they did. August 7th, 1944, 10 kilometers east of Saint-Lô, the 1st Infantry Division's reconnaissance platoon rolled through a liberated French village at speeds impossible during hedgerow warfare, jeeps and half-tracks moving at 30 miles per hour over roads the Germans had abandoned. Civilians lined the streets, throwing flowers, offering wine, crying and cheering as American vehicles passed. Children ran alongside, shouting "Vive l'Amérique." Soldiers who hadn't smiled in weeks found themselves grinning, waving, experiencing something that felt almost like the victory they'd imagined when they enlisted. This was the war they'd seen in newsreels' liberators, welcomed by grateful populations, rapid advances through countryside, enemy forces in retreat. After 6 weeks of hedgerow horror, where progress was measured in yards, the division was advancing miles per day. The breakout from Normandy had succeeded. German forces in western France were collapsing. Mobile warfare had returned. It felt like the beginning of the end, like Germany might surrender by Christmas, like the suffering might actually mean something. It wouldn't last. But for these few weeks in August, as the 1st Division raced across France toward Belgium, soldiers could believe they might survive this war. The strategic situation in early August was euphoric for Allied commanders. Operation Cobra had punched through German lines west of Saint-Lô. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen. German forces risked encirclement in the Falaise pocket, where hundreds of thousands of troops and vast amounts of equipment were trapped. George Patton's Third Army was driving east, exploiting gaps in German defences, moving so fast that supply lines struggled to keep up. Omar Bradley's First Army, including the 1st Infantry Division, had the mission of preventing German forces from escaping the pocket while simultaneously pushing toward Paris. For Allied planners who had spent years preparing for this campaign, who had watched the hedgerow stalemate with growing concern, the breakout was vindication. American mobility, firepower, and logistics were overwhelming static German defences. The question was whether German forces could establish new defensive lines before Allied momentum collapsed from overextended supply lines. The race was on. Could Americans reach the German border before Wehrmacht forces reconstituted? The 1st Division's role in the Falaise pocket operation was to anchor the northern shoulder of the encirclement, preventing German forces from breaking out toward Paris. This was both tactically sound and frustrating. Other divisions were racing east, capturing territory, liberating cities, getting glory. The 1st Division was holding positions and fighting German units trying to escape encirclement. The combat was vicious, German forces attempting breakout attacked with desperate intensity, knowing that capture meant imprisonment and failure to escape meant death or capture for divisions still trapped in the pocket. The 1st Division held, but it cost casualties at a time when the division could least afford them. Replacements were arriving in larger numbers now, but green soldiers thrown into combat against veteran German troops died quickly. The division was maintaining combat effectiveness through institutional memory and experienced NCOs who trained new soldiers on the job, but the percentage of combat experienced personnel was dropping with every engagement. By mid-August, many rifle companies had fewer than 10 soldiers who had landed at Omaha Beach. The division was the ship of Theseus, every plank replaced, yet still the same ship in designation and spirit. August 16th, 1944, Argentan. The 1st Division's advance elements reached the southern edge of the Falaise pocket, completing the encirclement. Tens of thousands of German soldiers and thousands of vehicles were trapped. Allied air power pounded the pocket continuously. Artillery fire fell day and night. The killing was industrial scale, but Supreme Allied Headquarters ordered American forces to halt rather than close the final gap, allowing British and Canadian forces to complete the encirclement from the north. The decision was politically motivated. Eisenhower wanted Montgomery's forces to share the victory and militarily questionable. The gap remained open for 3 days, allowing significant German forces to escape before the pocket closed completely. Soldiers of the 1st Division watched German convoys moving through artillery range and weren't allowed to fire. Officers who understood the implications were furious. The trapped German 7th Army would have been eliminated entirely if Americans had closed the gap immediately. Instead, perhaps 20 to 40% escaped, including staff officers and equipment that would reconstitute divisions the Allies would fight again in coming months. It was a strategic error driven by coalition politics, and the 1st Division would pay for it later. The advance from Normandy to Belgium covered 400 miles in 40 days, an astonishing pace by World War II standards. The division liberated dozens of French towns, crossed multiple rivers, fought dozens of small engagements with German rearguards, and maintained offensive pressure despite supply problems that worsened daily. Gasoline was the limiting factor. American armored and motorized divisions consumed fuel at rates the logistical system couldn't sustain. The Red Ball Express dedicated truck convoys running supplies from Normandy beaches to advancing forces operated 24 hours a day, but couldn't keep up with demand. The 1st Division, which relied on trucks for mobility and resupply, found itself rationing fuel, sometimes halting advances not because of enemy resistance but because vehicles had empty tanks. Soldiers learned to forage for supplies from abandoned German depots, to trade with French civilians, to make do with less. It was frustrating to be stopped by logistics when the enemy seemed defeated, but supply lines 400 miles long over war-damaged infrastructure couldn't be sustained indefinitely. September 3rd, 1944, Mons, Belgium. The 1st Division crossed the Belgian frontier to celebrations that exceeded anything they'd experienced in France. Belgium had been occupied since May 1944, years of German rule, 4 years of resistance and collaboration and survival. American arrival meant liberation in a way that resonated deeply. The division pushed through Mons and captured 25,000 German prisoners, remnants of units that had been shattered in the Normandy campaign and were retreating toward Germany. The prisoners were exhausted, poorly equipped, demoralized. Many surrendered willingly, relieved the war was over for them. This was different from North Africa or Sicily, where German prisoners had been confident their side would ultimately win. These prisoners knew Germany was losing. They didn't know when or how the war would end, but they recognized that fighting on meant dying for a lost cause. Their demoralization suggested Allied forces might push to Germany quickly, that the Wehrmacht might collapse before autumn. Intelligence reports supported this assessment. German units were under strength, supplies were limited, morale was low. The invasion of Germany itself seemed imminent. September 12, 1944, German frontier near Aachen. Lead elements of the 1st Infantry Division reached the German border and erected a sign. 1st Infantry Division, first on German soil. It was a moment of pride, the culmination of 2 years of combat from North Africa through Sicily through France. They had done what they set out to do, bring the war to Germany, The soldiers who posed for photographs at the border that day believed they might be in Berlin by October, but the advance stopped at the border. German defences stiffened dramatically. The Siegfried Line, called the West Wall by Germans, a system of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortifications along Germany's western border, had been prepared for exactly this scenario. German forces defending their homeland fought with renewed intensity, and Allied supply problems, manageable during the advance, became critical at the end of 400-mile supply lines. The division needed fuel, ammunition, replacement equipment, food, medical supplies. They needed rest for soldiers who had been in combat for 3 months. None of these needs could be met immediately. The Great Swan across France was over. The hard fighting was about to resume. The operational pause in mid-September gave soldiers time to reflect on what they had accomplished and what it had cost. Casualties from D-Day through mid-September totaled approximately 8,000 for the division, killed, wounded, missing. The division had been rebuilt multiple times over. Some soldiers who landed at Omaha were still present, but they were minority now. Most were replacements who arrived in June, July, August, September, thrown into combat with minimal training, expected to perform as well as North Africa veterans despite having no combat experience. The division maintained effectiveness through institutional knowledge preserved by a cadre of experienced NCOs and officers, but that cadre was shrinking. Every week, another veteran NCO was killed or wounded or evacuated for combat exhaustion. Junior officers died at such rates that promotions came rapidly. Privates became corporals, became sergeants, in weeks rather than years. Company commanders were often first lieutenants who had been second lieutenants 3 months earlier. The division worked because the survivors understood their jobs and could train newcomers quickly, but it was a fragile system. One more major battle might break it entirely. The euphoria of August's advance evaporated in September's stalemate. Soldiers who thought the war might end by Christmas realized it would continue through winter. Officers who believed Germany would collapse once Allies reached German territory understood they faced months of additional combat. Supply officers calculated that supporting sustained operations in Germany required logistics infrastructure that didn't exist and couldn't be created quickly. Intelligence officers analyzed German defensive preparations and concluded that penetrating the Siegfried Line would be as costly as the Normandy hedgerows. Strategic planners debated whether to concentrate forces for a single thrust into Germany or maintain broad front pressure, never quite acknowledging that logistics wouldn't support either strategy adequately. At ground level, where strategic debates meant nothing, soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division dug defensive positions along the German border and waited for orders. They had survived the longest summer of their lives. They had liberated France, they had reached Germany, and their reward was that the war would continue, that they would attack fortifications designed to stop exactly the kind of assault they would be ordered to make, that their division's reputation for accomplishing impossible missions meant they would be assigned those missions repeatedly until casualties made them combat ineffective or the war ended. Whichever came first, they hoped for the latter, they expected the former, and they prepared to attack Aachen, the first German city that would fall to Allied forces, a battle that would consume October and prove that German forces defending their homeland were far more dangerous than German forces defending occupied territory. The Great Swan was over. The grinding horror had returned. And the 1st Infantry Division would grind forward because that's what they did, what they had always done, what their tradition demanded. They continued doing even when continuation seemed impossible. October 8th, 1944, outskirts of Aachen, Germany. The city that had been Charlemagne's capital, where Holy Roman Emperors were crowned for 600 years, sat 2 miles ahead of 1st Infantry Division forward positions. Aachen was the first major German city Allied forces would attack, and Hitler had declared it would be defended to the last man. The declaration wasn't rhetoric. German forces had spent weeks fortifying every building, every intersection, every approach. The Siegfried Line bunkers around the city provided defensive depth. Civilian evacuation had been ordered but not completed. Thousands of German civilians remained in basements and shelters, complicating American targeting decisions. American strategy was straightforward. Encircle the city, offer surrender terms, attack if refused. The German commander, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, refused surrender on October 8th. His message to American envoys was brief: Aachen would be defended. The 1st Infantry Division's 26th Infantry Regiment supported by the 3rd Armored Division, had the mission of reducing the city. They had 3 weeks to accomplish what intelligence suggested might take months. Every soldier who had fought in Sicily remembered Troina, remembered house-to-house urban combat, remembered how cities devoured units. Aachen would be worse. Aachen was Germany, and Germans defending their homeland fought with desperation that occupied populations hadn't shown. Urban warfare doctrine in 1944 was primitive compared to later developments. American forces had some experience from Sicily and North African cities, but doctrine emphasized speed and firepower over methodical clearance. The preferred method was overwhelming artillery bombardment to destroy defenses, followed by infantry assault to occupy rubble. This approach worked against demoralized defenders or poorly fortified positions. It didn't work in Aachen. German defenders had reinforced buildings with concrete, had created interconnected defensive positions using sewers and underground passages, had stocked ammunition and supplies for extended combat. American artillery could destroy buildings but couldn't kill defenders in reinforced basements. American armor couldn't navigate rubble-filled streets. American infantry advancing through ruins faced machine guns firing from positions they couldn't locate. The first day of urban combat cost 200 casualties for minimal gains. By the second day, officers realized Aachen would require tactical innovation and patience the division's aggressive culture found frustrating. The Bangalore Ring tactic emerged from desperation and proved effective. Tank infantry teams would identify a fortified building, bring a Sherman tank within 50 yards, and fire high-explosive shells directly into the structure at point-blank range. The concussion alone could stun defenders even in reinforced positions. Once the building was breached, infantry would assault through the hole, clearing rooms with grenades and small arms. The process was slow hours to clear a single building, but it worked. By mid-October, the division had refined the tactic to an industrial process. Engineer teams would mark cleared buildings with white paint, marked buildings being cleared with yellow, marked buildings still enemy held with red. Artillery would target red buildings with white phosphorus to mark them for aircraft. Tank destroyer units would provide direct fire support. Infantry would clear systematically, building by building, block by block. It was methodical, grim work that had more in common with demolition than traditional combat. Casualties remained high. Snipers killed soldiers who exposed themselves for seconds. Machine guns covered every approach. Booby traps killed the careless and unlucky equally. Civilian presence complicated every engagement. German defenders sometimes used civilian buildings as firing positions, knowing Americans would hesitate to destroy structures that might contain non-combatants. Other times, defenders would abandon positions when civilians were present, using them as human shields while retreating. American infantry encountered civilians in basements, terrified families who had nowhere to go while combat raged above them. Rules of engagement required soldiers to treat civilians humanely, even when those civilians were German citizens whose country was at war with America. Young soldiers who'd been raised on propaganda about evil Nazis found themselves confronting elderly Germans, women, children who were victims of the war as much as participants in it. The moral clarity that sustained soldiers through North Africa and France eroded when facing German civilians. Some soldiers remained hard, viewing all Germans as enemy. Others felt conflict between duty and humanity. The psychological strain added to combat stress in ways that affected soldiers differently depending on their backgrounds and beliefs. October 20th, 1944, fighting reached Aachen Cathedral. The massive Gothic structure had survived centuries, but was now threatened by 20th century war. German snipers operated from the bell tower, using elevation to cover American approaches. American artillery commanders had authority to destroy the cathedral if militarily necessary, but nobody wanted that responsibility. The solution was precision. A single tank destroyer was positioned to fire at the bell tower with armor-piercing rounds. The first shot killed the snipers. The second disabled the tower's structure without collapsing it. The cathedral survived with damage, but intact. This restraint exercised while combat raged in streets around the cathedral reflected a complicated morality. Allied forces were destroying Aachen systematically, reducing 80% of the city to rubble, but they preserved architectural landmarks when possible. It was simultaneously brutal and civilized, recognizing that cultural heritage mattered even during total war. Whether this restraint was appropriate when American soldiers were dying to preserve German architecture remained debated, Some officers argued all buildings should be destroyed if it saved American lives. Others argued preserving cultural sites maintained moral distinction between Allied forces and the enemy they fought. October 21st, 1944, Colonel Gerhard Wilk surrendered with approximately 3,000 surviving German soldiers. 19 days of combat had reduced Aachen to ruins. German casualties were estimated at 5,000 killed or captured. 1st Division casualties were 498 killed, 2,000 wounded, about 15% of the division's strength. The cost-benefit analysis was brutal. One German city had cost 2,500 American casualties. Germany had dozens of cities that would likely be defended with equal intensity. If every German city cost proportional casualties, the mathematics suggested the war would consume the entire American army before reaching Berlin. This realization spread through officer ranks and generated intense debates about strategy. Bradley's broad front approach ensured all divisions shared combat burden equally, but it also meant every objective was fought for at full cost. An alternative concentrate force, breakthrough at single point, exploit with armoured advance might reduce total casualties but would require some divisions to absorb disproportionate losses while others supported. The 1st Division, ironically, would have preferred concentration. They were already absorbing disproportionate combat missions. Better to fight one decisive battle than grind through dozens of bloody stalemates. The fall of Aachen made international headlines as the first German city captured by Allies, but soldiers who fought there remembered it for different reasons. They remembered the claustrophobic terror of room-to-room combat, where enemies were feet away behind walls and death came from everywhere. They remembered the smell of burned buildings, decomposing bodies, sewage from broken pipes, mixing with chemical residue from explosives. They remembered the noise-constant artillery, small arms fire echoing in ruined streets, walls collapsing, people screaming. They remembered exhaustion so complete that soldiers fell asleep standing up, would wake hours later still standing because sitting down required effort they couldn't manage. They remembered friends killed by snipers they never saw, killed by artillery, fired from positions miles away, killed by booby traps left in buildings that appeared clear. They remembered thinking this would be the worst combat they'd experience, then realizing if every German city was defended like Aachen, they wouldn't survive to see Berlin. Aachen was victory, but victory had become a grim accounting of casualties accepted to achieve objectives that immediately became irrelevant because the next objective was always waiting. The month between Aachen's fall and the next major operation should have been rest, but rest for the 1st Infantry Division meant maintaining defensive positions, conducting patrols, absorbing replacements, training new soldiers in combat techniques that could only be learned in combat. November brought cold weather, early snow, and the misery of field conditions without adequate shelter or supplies. Soldiers rotated through front lines, spending days in foxholes filled with water, eating cold rations because fires attracted artillery, sleeping in shifts because German patrols probed American lines nightly. This wasn't combat in the dramatic sense, no major attacks, no territory changing hands, but it was corrosive. Soldiers died from disease, from accidents, from random artillery shells, from a dozen ways that didn't make headlines but were just as final as dramatic combat deaths. The division's strength dropped not from battles but from attrition, men worn down by conditions until they couldn't continue. Medical officers evacuated soldiers for pneumonia, for trench foot, so severe amputation was necessary, for combat exhaustion that manifested as catatonia or violence or complete withdrawal. The division was being consumed slowly, and what emerged was something harder and more brittle. Soldiers who survived by suppressing empathy and emotion, who functioned because caring was impossible, who did their jobs with mechanical efficiency because nothing else was sustainable. By late November, when orders came for the next operation, the 1st Infantry Division was combat effective by metrics that measured readiness, adequate personnel strength, sufficient equipment, acceptable training levels, but fundamentally damaged in ways metrics couldn't capture. The soldiers had seen too much, survived too much, lost too much. They functioned because professional military training created behavioral patterns that persisted even when motivations collapsed. They followed orders not from belief in mission or patriotism or even unit pride, but because following orders was habit, and habit was stronger than despair. Officers who understood this worried about what happened when habit wasn't enough, when soldiers faced combat so intense that mechanical obedience failed and personal motivation became necessary. That moment was coming. The next operation would take the division into the Hurtgen Forest. where German defences and natural terrain combined to create the most lethal battlefield American forces would encounter in the European theatre. Aachen had cost 2,500 casualties over 3 weeks. The Hürtgen Forest would cost 4,000 casualties over 5 weeks and would break the division in ways that Omaha Beach, the hedgerows, and Aachen hadn't. But nobody knew that yet. In late November 1944, the 1st Infantry Division loaded onto trucks heading toward the Hürtgen, and soldiers who had survived every previous campaign prepared for what they hoped would be the last major battle before winter forced a halt to operations. They were wrong. The worst was ahead. And this time, survival wouldn't be enough. October 28th, 1944, eastern edge of Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Soldiers of the 16th Infantry Regiment stared into a forest that looked like something from a dark fairy tale. Dense fir trees blocked sunlight even at midday, creating perpetual twilight. The canopy was so thick that rain never reached the ground. As rain, it dripped constantly, turning everything into cold mud. Visibility was measured in feet, sometimes yards, never more than 50 yards even with clear lines of sight. The forest floor was a tangle of fallen trees, undergrowth, and deceptive terrain that concealed ravines and sudden drops. American intelligence described the Hürtgen as broken, heavily wooded terrain, unsuitable for large-scale operations. That assessment was correct, which made the decision to attack through it incomprehensible to soldiers ordered to do so. The objective was to reach the Rohr River dams, whose control would prevent Germans from flooding the river valley and blocking American advances. The objective made strategic sense. The method, grinding through the most defensible terrain in Western Europe against veteran German troops fighting on their own soil, made no sense at all. But orders were orders. The 1st Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen Forest on October 28th. They would emerge 5 weeks later as a shattered shell of what they had been. The forest itself was as much enemy as German forces. Trees grew so densely that coordinating movements larger than squad level was nearly impossible. Units became separated within minutes. Communication by radio failed because terrain blocked signals. Running wire for field telephones required linesmen to string cable through areas under constant observation, making them easy targets. Artillery, which had been decisive in every previous campaign, became a liability. Shells fired at German positions exploded in the tree canopy rather than on the ground, creating airbursts that rained wood shrapnel on everyone below, Americans and Germans equally. Tree bursts killed and wounded soldiers in ways high-explosive shells alone couldn't, turning splinters into projectiles that shredded flesh and broke bones. American armor couldn't operate effectively, tanks bogged down in mud, couldn't navigate between trees, presented easy targets for German anti-tank weapons. Air support was impossible, pilots couldn't see targets through the canopy. The division was reduced to World War I-style infantry combat, small units advancing on foot through terrain that negated every technological advantage America possessed. And the Germans were waiting. German defensive positions in the Hürtgen had been prepared with meticulous care. Concrete bunkers from the Siegfried Line provided defensive backbone. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire along the few trails that penetrated the forest. Artillery was pre-registered on likely American approach routes, allowing German gunners to drop shells with devastating accuracy on coordinates they had already ranged. Minefields, thousands of anti-personnel mines were laid along trails and in approaches to German positions. The mines were particularly cruel, designed not to kill but to maim, blowing off feet or legs, requiring multiple soldiers to evacuate one casualty, and creating psychological terror that slowed advances more effectively than casualties alone. Booby traps supplemented mines, grenades rigged to detonate when tripwires were disturbed, explosives hidden in seemingly innocuous objects, devices designed to kill the curious and the careless. German infantry fought from positions they had occupied for weeks, knew the terrain intimately, and could withdraw through prepared routes when American pressure became too intense. They would fall back to the next defensive line and repeat the process. Every 100 yards, the 1st Division advanced cost casualties that couldn't be replaced quickly enough. November 2nd, 1944, assault on Crucifix Hill. The 26th Infantry Regiment attacked a slight elevation, barely a hill by normal standards, that dominated surrounding terrain enough to be militarily significant. The attack began before dawn with artillery preparation that accomplished nothing except alerting German defenders that assault was imminent. Infantry advanced through the forest in squad columns, moving slowly because visibility was minimal and mines were everywhere. German machine guns opened fire from positions American soldiers couldn't see, cutting down the first waves. Survivors went to ground, pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Artillery called to suppress German positions fell short, hitting American soldiers because forward observers couldn't see targets clearly enough to adjust fire. The assault stalled within an hour. By mid-morning, the regiment had gained 300 yards at a cost of 200 casualties, a 2-to-3 ratio that was unsustainable. Officers called off the attack and prepared to try again the next day. The next day was equally costly and equally unsuccessful. For 3 days, the 26th Infantry attacked the same objective, losing men continuously, before finally securing Crucifix Hill on November 5th. German forces had withdrawn to the next defensive position. The pattern would repeat for weeks. Medical evacuation in the Huebner was its own nightmare. Wounded soldiers couldn't be extracted quickly because terrain prevented vehicle access. Litter teams carried casualties through the forest on foot, moving slowly through mud and undergrowth while under sporadic fire. The journey from frontline positions to aid stations often took hours, during which wounded men received only basic first aid from medics who were themselves exhausted and traumatized. Aid stations near the forest were overwhelmed continuously. Surgeons operated in tents, often by flashlight because generators were unreliable, performing triage on casualties faster than they could be treated. The division's medical battalion saw injuries they had rarely encountered, tree-burst wounds that filled bodies with wooden shrapnel that X-rays couldn't detect easily, mine wounds that destroyed limbs and required amputation, cold weather injuries from exposure and wet conditions. Combat exhaustion cases rivaled physical casualties by mid-November. Men arrived at aid stations who weren't physically wounded but were psychologically destroyed, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak, staring into nothing, crying without stopping. Medical officers sedated them, evacuated them to rear hospitals, and knew most would never return to combat. The division was being destroyed not just physically but psychologically, and there was no solution because the attack continued regardless of casualties. November 16th, 1944, the aid station near Hamich processed its 300th casualty of the day by early afternoon. Captain Marcus Weisberg, the battalion surgeon, had been operating continuously for 18 hours. His hands shook from exhaustion, his vision blurred, but wounded men kept arriving. Some had injuries consistent with combat bullet wounds, shrapnel wounds, blast injuries. Others had injuries that reflected the particular horror of the Huebner tree-burst wounds, filled with wood fragments, mine wounds that had destroyed feet or genitals, trench foot so severe that tissue was dead and infected, and increasingly Weisberg saw men who had no visible wounds but were casualties nonetheless. They had stopped functioning, stopped caring, stopped being able to force themselves forward into combat. They sat in the aid station, vacant-eyed, unresponsive. Weisberg documented them as combat exhaustion and evacuated them because keeping them in the line endangered others. But he knew this was epidemic, not isolated cases. The entire division was approaching a psychological breaking point where will alone couldn't sustain combat effectiveness. Human beings had limits, and the Huebner was exceeding those limits systematically. Weisberg wrote in his journal that night, a journal that would survive the war, that he was treating casualties from a battle that shouldn't have been fought, that the objectives weren't worth the cost, that someone at headquarters was sacrificing the division for reasons that made no sense. He was correct, though he wouldn't learn why until after the war. November 21st through 22nd, the division's assault on Merode represented the Huebner campaign in miniature initial success followed by catastrophic reversal. 2 companies from the 26th Infantry fought their way into the village and briefly held Merode Castle, a medieval fortress that had become a German defensive position. For 12 hours, American soldiers held the castle against counterattacks, believing reinforcements would arrive. Reinforcements couldn't get through, roads were blocked, German artillery prevented movement, and the units designated to support were themselves pinned down. German forces counterattacked with armor and infantry in overwhelming strength. The 2 American companies were destroyed, approximately 300 men killed or captured. Survivors who escaped described fighting room to room in the castle, running out of ammunition, using German weapons scavenged from dead defenders, holding until the position became untenable and withdrawal the only option. Less than 50 men from the two companies made it back to American lines. Merritt illustrated the fundamental problem with the Hurtgen campaign. Tactical victories couldn't be sustained because terrain prevented exploitation. Units could take objectives but couldn't hold them without continuous resupply and reinforcement, which terrain made impossible. The division was winning battles and losing the campaign simultaneously. By late November, 1st Infantry Division regiments were at 30 to 40% strength. The 16th Infantry had started the Hurtgen campaign with approximately 3,000 men and was down to 1,200 effectives. The 18th Infantry was similarly depleted. The 26th Infantry had suffered worst, reduced to barely 1,000 combat-capable soldiers. Replacement troops arrived continuously but died or were evacuated so quickly that units couldn't maintain cohesion. Some companies were commanded by second lieutenants who had been privates 6 months earlier, promoted through casualties rather than merit. Platoons were led by sergeants who had been corporals when they entered the forest. Squad leaders were often the most experienced private in the squad, which might mean 3 weeks of combat experience. Institutional knowledge, the accumulated tactical wisdom that made veteran units effective, was disappearing as the men who possessed that knowledge became casualties. The division was becoming an assemblage of individuals rather than a cohesive organization. Soldiers who followed orders, because that's what soldiers did, but who had lost the unit pride and trust that made units more than the sum of their parts. December 3rd, 1944, the 1st Infantry Division was pulled from the Hurtgen Forest after 5 weeks of continuous combat. They had advanced approximately 3 kilometers at a cost of over 4,000 casualties, approximately 1 casualty per meter advanced. The Roar River dams, the operation's strategic objective, remained in German hands. The dams could have been bombed by air forces at any point, making the entire ground campaign unnecessary in retrospect. Post-war analysis would call the Hurtgen Forest campaign one of the great American tactical mistakes of World War II, a battle that consumed units for objectives of questionable value using methods that guaranteed maximum casualties. None of this mattered to soldiers boarding trucks out of the forest. They had survived. Friends hadn't. The division they had been part of, the proud, aggressive, confident Big Red One, no longer existed. What remained was a damaged organization held together by designation and tradition, but no longer capable of sustained offensive operations. They needed rest, needed time to absorb replacements and rebuild cohesion, needed psychological recovery that would take months, if not years. Instead, they were sent to a quiet sector in Belgium for recuperation. Within 2 weeks, German forces would launch the largest counteroffensive of the Western European campaign. The 1st Infantry Division, shattered by the Hurtgen, would be thrown into the Battle of the Bulge before they had recovered from the battle that nearly destroyed them. The Hurtgen Forest broke the 1st Infantry Division in ways that previous campaigns hadn't, because previous campaigns had offered some hope of success proportionate to sacrifice. North Africa had lessons to learn. Sicily had been strategic. Normandy was necessary. Aachen was the first German city. These could be understood as meaningful even when costly. The Hurtgen couldn't be rationalized. It was senseless violence that accomplished nothing strategic at enormous human cost. Soldiers who survived carried a particular bitterness, not the healthy anger that comes from surviving combat, but a corrosive resentment toward leadership that would order such attacks, toward a military system that consumed units without regard for their humanity, toward a war that demanded sacrifice beyond reason. Some soldiers broke psychologically and never recovered, spending decades after the war reliving the forest in nightmares and flashbacks. Others survived by suppressing memory, refusing to discuss what happened, moving forward through life by never looking back. Still others maintained functionality by transforming experience into dark humor or fatalistic acceptance. But none emerged from the Hurtgen unchanged. The forest had stripped away illusions about war's glory, about leadership's competence, about sacrifice's meaning. What remained were men who had survived horror and had to construct meaning from survival, because the alternative, accepting that friends died for nothing, was psychologically unbearable. The 1st Infantry Division would rebuild. They would fight again. They would achieve victories in subsequent campaigns. But the Hurtgen Forest remained the defining trauma, the moment when being part of the Big Red One meant being sent to die in a battle that shouldn't have been fought, in a forest that should have been bypassed, for objectives that could have been achieved through other means at far lower cost. It was the moment when institutional pride became institutional curse, when the division's reputation for accomplishing impossible missions meant they were assigned those missions regardless of cost, when being first meant being sacrificed. And every soldier who survived carried that knowledge forward, that excellence was punished with more dangerous assignments, that victory earned not rest but harder battles, that being the best division in the American army meant dying faster than worse divisions because the best got used until they broke. The Hurtgen Forest was where the 1st Infantry Division learned that lesson completely. They would carry it with them through the rest of the war and the rest of their lives. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, supposedly in a rest area near Eupen after the Hurtgen nightmare, were awakened by distant artillery rumbling. The sound was wrong, too sustained, too concentrated, coming from the wrong direction. German artillery had been sporadic for weeks, random harassing fire. This was different. This was concentrated bombardment of the type that preceded major attacks. But intelligence had been certain German forces lacked capability for offensive operations. Allied commanders believed the Wehrmacht was finished as an offensive force, capable only of defensive fighting, as American and British armies pushed toward Germany. The artillery continued for an hour, then stopped. Silence returned. Soldiers went back to sleep, assuming it was just heavier than usual, harassing fire. At 0800 hours, runners arrived with urgent orders. German forces had launched a major counter-offensive south of 1st Division positions. Multiple American divisions were under attack. Situation reports were fragmentary and contradictory, but the scale was clearly massive. The division that had left the Hurtgen Forest 2 weeks earlier, that desperately needed rest and recovery, was being ordered to move immediately to block German advances. They loaded onto trucks in chaos, grabbing weapons and equipment, leaving behind anything not immediately necessary. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the 1st Infantry Division would spend the next month fighting the largest German offensive of the Western European campaign. Adolf Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive was strategically ambitious and tactically desperate. Germany needed to change the strategic situation in the West before Allied forces entered Germany proper. Hitler believed that splitting American and British forces, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, and inflicting catastrophic casualties on Allied armies would force a negotiated peace, or at least buy time for Germany to develop new weapons. The plan concentrated 200,000 troops, 500 tanks, and approximately 2,000 artillery pieces for a surprise attack through the Ardennes Forest, the same route Germany had used to invade France in 1940. Allied intelligence had dismissed the Ardennes as unsuitable for major operations, leaving it weakly defended. German forces achieved complete surprise on December 16th, shattering American defensive lines and creating a bulge in Allied front, hence the battle's name. Initial German success was stunning. American units were overrun, thousands captured, equipment abandoned. But German planning assumed good weather, adequate fuel supplies, and American demoralization. None of these assumptions proved correct. Weather cleared enough for Allied air power to operate. German fuel supplies were insufficient, leaving armoured divisions stranded. And American forces, though surprised and defeated in initial battles, didn't collapse. They retreated, regrouped, and fought back. The 1st Infantry Division would be critical to that fight back, not because they were fresh and ready, but because they were experienced enough to function effectively in chaos. December 17th, the division moved south in column, passing through Belgian villages that had been celebrating liberation weeks earlier and were now panicked about German return. Civilians lined roads, watching American trucks race past, seeing the fear on soldiers' faces, and understanding that the war wasn't over, that liberation might be temporary. The division's movement was hampered by refugees, civilians fleeing, advancing German forces, clogging roads, creating traffic jams that prevented military movement. Officers had to make brutal decisions about priority. Should trucks wait for civilian evacuations to clear roads, or should they push through regardless of civilian casualties? Some chose to wait, creating delays that potentially cost military advantage. Others pushed through, creating civilian casualties that would haunt them after the war. By December 18th, the division reached positions around Butgenbach, a small town northeast of the developing Bulge. Intelligence indicated German armoured forces were driving west and north, attempting to reach the Meuse River and then Antwerp. If German armour broke through at Butgenbach, they would have clear access to Liège and from there to Allied rear areas. The 1st Infantry Division had to hold Butgenbach regardless of cost. It was Omaha Beach's strategic imperative repeated hold or die, because losing meant catastrophic consequences. December 20th through 21st, 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth Division attacked Buchenbach with approximately 100 tanks and supporting infantry. These were veteran German troops, fanatical believers in Nazi ideology, who fought with suicidal courage. The 1st Division's positions were hastily prepared, foxholes dug in frozen ground, anti-tank guns positioned to cover approaches, artillery pre-registered on likely attack routes. When German armour appeared through morning fog, American gunners let them close to killing range before opening fire. The first wave of German tanks was destroyed within minutes. 57mm anti-tank guns, 75mm tank destroyers, 90mm anti-aircraft guns used in ground roll, all fired at point-blank range. German tanks exploded, turrets flying off hulls, crews incinerated. But more tanks came. The attacks continued throughout December 20th, German forces probing for weakness, finding none, losing tanks continuously. By December 21st, the 12th SS Panzer had lost over 30 tanks at Buchenbach and withdrew. The 1st Infantry Division had held. The northern shoulder of the Bulge was secure. German forces couldn't expand the salient northward. This forced them to concentrate attacks in the center of the Bulge, where American forces could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. The strategic implications were enormous. Buchenbach prevented German forces from achieving the breakout they needed. The 1st Division's defense, while less dramatic than Baston's more famous stand, was equally important strategically. Holding Buchenbach cost the division approximately 1,400 casualties over 10 days of fighting light by Hurtgen standards, but devastating to a division that had entered the battle already depleted. More significantly, the psychological impact of being thrown from one crisis directly into another threatened to break soldiers who were already near their limit. Men who had survived the Hurtgen forest by believing they would get rest now understood there was no rest, that combat would continue indefinitely, that survival meant nothing except being available for the next impossible mission. Combat exhaustion cases spiked again. Medical officers evacuated soldiers who simply couldn't continue, who had reached psychological breaking points where will and discipline no longer functioned. Some of these evacuations were legitimate men who needed psychiatric treatment. Others were soldiers at their limit who would have recovered with rest, but instead were evacuated permanently. The division was losing combat effectiveness not through casualties but through accumulated trauma that exceeded human capacity to process. Officers recognized this but had no solution. The battle continued. The division fought because that's what divisions did. Individual suffering mattered less than collective mission accomplishment, at least in military calculus. Whether this calculus was morally defensible was a question nobody at division level had time to address. Christmas Day, 1944, should have been a moment of reflection and rest. Instead, it was another day of combat. German attacks continued, though with less intensity as their offensive lost momentum. American soldiers in foxholes around Buchenbach received holiday packages from home, letters from families, cookies that had survived transatlantic shipping, small presents that seemed absurd in combat conditions. Some men cried reading letters from home. Others couldn't open packages, couldn't connect the normalcy of home with the reality of combat. Chaplains held services in snow, brief ceremonies that acknowledged Christmas while recognizing that celebration was impossible under circumstances where friends had just died and more would die tomorrow. The disconnection between what Christmas meant, peace, hope, joy, and what Christmas was another day of trying not to die, created cognitive dissonance that some soldiers processed through dark humor and others processed through shutting down emotionally. The only way to survive psychologically was to stop caring about anything except immediate survival. Religion, family, future plans, all of these became abstractions that couldn't coexist with combat's immediate demands. Soldiers who maintained hope and humanity often broke under accumulated stress. Soldiers who suppressed hope and became mechanical often survived but carried emotional damage that lasted decades. By early January 1945, German offensive had been contained and Allied counteroffensive began to eliminate the Bulge and restore original front lines. The 1st Infantry Division participated in this counteroffensive, though in supporting rather than leading role. Other divisions, less depleted, took the primary offensive missions. The 1st Division held positions, conducted local attacks, supported the overall effort without being the spearhead. This was simultaneously relief they weren't being asked to do the impossible again and insulting to institutional pride. The division that had always been first, that had led every major American operation from North Africa through Normandy, was now a supporting unit because they had been used so hard they couldn't lead anymore. Officers understood this was temporary, that the division would rebuild and resume its primary role. Soldiers understood it differently. They had been broken by their own competence, destroyed by being too good at their jobs. The division's reputation had become a death sentence, ensuring they received the hardest missions until they couldn't accomplish hard missions anymore, at which point they would be rebuilt and sent to do it again. This pattern, use until broken, rebuild, use until broken again, would continue through the rest of the war. January 15th, 1945, the Bulge was eliminated and front lines restored to approximately pre-December positions. German forces had suffered catastrophic casualties, 120,000 killed, wounded, or captured, hundreds of tanks destroyed, offensive capability broken permanently. American casualties exceeded 80,000, with the 1st Infantry Division's 1,400 representing a small fraction of total cost. Strategic analysts would later debate whether the Bulge changed anything. Germany was losing before the offensive, would lose after it, perhaps slightly faster due to losses incurred during the attack. Soldiers who fought the battle didn't care about strategic analysis. They knew friends had died, knew they had survived when others hadn't, knew the war continued, and they would be expected to keep fighting until it ended, or they died, or were wounded severely enough to be evacuated. The Bulge wasn't a turning point for them. It was another nightmare in a series of nightmares that constituted their war experience. They had entered the Bulge as a division, recovering from the Hurtgen Forest. They emerged from the Bulge as a division that had demonstrated it could function effectively even when shattered, even when exhausted beyond reason, even when hope had been abandoned. This was simultaneously the division's greatest strength and greatest curse. They would never be allowed to rest because they had proven rest was unnecessary for mission accomplishment. The personal cost of continuous combat without adequate rest was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Soldiers developed 1,000-yard stares, unfocused gazes that suggested consciousness but no presence. They stopped caring about hygiene, about appearance, about anything except immediate survival. Relationships within units became simultaneously closer and more distant. Men trusted squad mates with their lives but couldn't form emotional connections because emotional connection made loss unbearable. Many soldiers developed superstitions, lucky charms, rituals performed before combat, beliefs that certain actions would ensure survival. Statistically, these were meaningless, but psychologically they provided illusion of control in situations where control was impossible. Officers tried to maintain morale through various means: mail from home, hot meals when possible, rotation to rear areas for brief rest. But morale in traditional sense, belief in mission, confidence in victory, positive emotional state, had been replaced by something else. Soldiers didn't believe in anything except that fighting would continue until war ended. They didn't feel positive about anything except brief moments when combat paused. They functioned because training and discipline created behavioral patterns that persisted even when emotional foundations collapsed. This was sustainable short-term but created long-term psychological damage that many wouldn't recognize until decades after the war, when nightmares and hypervigilance and inability to form emotional connections destroyed marriages and careers and lives. The 1st Infantry Division's combat effectiveness in early 1945 came at psychological costs that wouldn't be fully paid until long after the war ended. February 8th, 1945, Ruhr River, Germany. The 1st Infantry Division prepared to cross the last major natural barrier before the Rhine, the river that symbolized Germany's heartland. The Ruhr was swollen from German demolition of upstream dams, the same dams that were supposed to have been captured during the Hurtgen Forest campaign, but remained in German hands until American forces finally took them in early February. The river was 300 feet wide, moving fast, cold enough to kill through hypothermia within minutes. German forces held the eastern bank in strength, with machine guns positioned to cover approaches and artillery pre-sighted on the river. Crossing would require amphibious operations under fire, establishing beachheads, expanding control before German counterattacks could destroy bridgeheads. It was Omaha Beach in miniature, all the same problems of amphibious assault against prepared defences, just on a smaller scale. The division had done this before, they would do it again. Engineers prepared assault boats, small craft that held a dozen men, powered by outboard motors that were unreliable in cold weather. Infantry rehearsed boarding procedures, practiced exiting boats under simulated fire, checked weapons and equipment. By early morning of February 8th, everything was ready. This would be the last river crossing before the Rhine. After the Rhine came the final push into Germany's heartland. The end was approaching. Soldiers who had fought since North Africa could sense it, could imagine surviving, could begin to hope again. That hope was dangerous. Men who started believing they might survive sometimes became cautious, sometimes made mistakes, sometimes died just before the war ended. But hope was also necessary. Without it, soldiers were just mechanisms executing orders. With it, they were human beings with futures to fight for. The Ruhr crossing succeeded through a combination of preparation, firepower, and violence. Artillery bombardment began before dawn, targeting German positions on the eastern bank. Smoke shells created obscuration that partially hid assault boats. Engineers launched boats, infantry boarded, motors started, some failed, requiring soldiers to paddle manually. The crossing took minutes, felt like hours. German machine guns opened fire through smoke, hitting some boats, sinking others. Men in sinking boats tried to swim in full equipment. Most drowned. Boats that reached the eastern bank disgorged infantry who immediately assaulted German positions. The fighting was close quarters and brutal grenades, bayonets, hand-to-hand combat in some instances. By mid-morning, the division held a narrow beachhead. Engineers began constructing pontoon bridges to move vehicles and heavy equipment across. German artillery pounded the bridges, destroying some, damaging others, but engineers rebuilt them under fire. By evening, the division had a sustainable bridgehead and was expanding eastward. Casualties were moderate by division standards, approximately 200 killed and wounded, but moderate casualties were still 200 families receiving telegrams, 200 soldiers dead or maimed, 200 reasons why victory always felt incomplete. The advance from the Ruhr to the Rhine covered 40 miles in 3 weeks, slower than the August 1944 breakout but faster than hedgerow warfare. German resistance varied. Some units fought fanatically, others surrendered quickly, still others simply evaporated, soldiers deserting or retreating without orders. The Wehrmacht was collapsing unevenly, some formations maintaining discipline and combat effectiveness, while others disintegrated. The 1st Division encountered increasingly diverse opponents: Wehrmacht regulars, Waffen-SS fanatics, Hitler Youth teenagers with rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, Volkssturm Home Guard units composed of men too old or too young for regular military service. The variety reflected Germany's desperation. They were mobilizing every available person, regardless of training or capability, throwing them into defensive positions to slow Allied advances. Some fought well, most didn't. The division's combat reports from February and March read like catalogues of diminishing resistance, interrupted by occasional fierce combat when encountering veteran German units. The pattern was clear: Germany was losing, everyone knew it, but some Germans kept fighting anyway, from ideology or discipline or inability to conceive of alternatives. March 6, 1945, the division reached the suburbs of Cologne, Germany's 4th largest city, a major industrial and cultural centre reduced to ruins by years of Allied bombing. The city was defended by a mix of Wehrmacht regulars, SS troops, and Volkssturm militia. American strategy for Cologne was straightforward: encircle, bombard, assault. The division's role was to secure the northern suburbs, while other units attacked from south and east. Combat in Cologne's outskirts resembled Aachen, building-to-building fighting, tank infantry teams, methodical clearance. But German resistance was weaker than at Aachen, partially because bombing had destroyed defensive infrastructure, partially because defenders were less motivated. By March 7th, the division reached the Rhine at Cologne and held positions overlooking the river. Across the Rhine was Cologne Cathedral, one of Europe's great Gothic structures, damaged by bombing but still standing. The cathedral's survival seemed miraculous given the destruction around it. Some soldiers saw it as symbol of civilization persisting through war. Others saw it as random chance the cathedral survived because bombers had missed it, not because of divine intervention. Regardless, the Rhine was reached. The next challenge was crossing it. The Remagen Bridge capture on March 7th by elements of 9th Armoured Division changed Allied strategy fundamentally. The Ludendorff Bridge, a railroad bridge that German demolition teams had tried and failed to destroy, completely provided Americans with an intact Rhine crossing. Within hours of its capture, Supreme Allied Command redirected forces to exploit the breakthrough. The 1st Infantry Division, instead of assaulting across the Rhine at Cologne as planned, was redirected to cross at Remagen and exploit the bridgehead. The division moved south, crossed on March 15th over pontoon bridges erected after the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed from damage and overstrain on March 17th, and entered Germany's heartland. The Rhine crossing, which should have been a major operation costing thousands of casualties, instead was routine because of Remagen. Soldiers who had prepared mentally for another Omaha-style assault found themselves crossing unopposed and felt simultaneous relief and anticlimactic disappointment. The war was ending through accumulation of small victories and German collapse rather than through dramatic battles. This was strategically preferable but psychologically unsatisfying for soldiers who needed closure through definitive victories. April 12, 1945, the division's route took them through Falkenau and Eder-Eger, a small town in Sudetenland where a satellite concentration camp held political prisoners and Jews who had survived earlier camps. American intelligence hadn't identified Falkenau as a concentration camp. It was too small to appear on strategic maps. When division patrols entered the camp, they found approximately 1,000 prisoners in various stages of starvation and disease. Many were too weak to stand. Some had died hours or days earlier and lay where they fell because surviving prisoners lacked strength to bury them. The smell was overwhelming: human waste, decomposition, sickness. Soldiers who had survived years of combat found themselves unable to process what they were seeing. This wasn't combat. This was systematic dehumanization and murder on a scale that exceeded battlefield horror. The camp wasn't Auschwitz or Buchenwald, no gas chambers, no industrial-scale killing apparatus, but that somehow made it worse. Falkenau was small, local, the kind of place that existed throughout German-controlled territory. If this was happening in an insignificant town, what had happened in major camps? The division's response to Falkenau reflected both humanity and rage. Medics treated survivors, though many were beyond saving. Starvation and disease had progressed too far. Engineers organized food distribution, but feeding starved people was dangerous. Too much food too quickly could kill. Military government officers began documenting what they found, taking photographs, collecting testimony, and officers ordered the local German civilian population to witness what had been done in their names. Citizens of Falkenau were marched to the camp and forced to look at prisoners, forced to smell the dead, forced to understand that this had been happening in their town while they claimed ignorance. Some Germans wept. Some were defiant, insisting they didn't know. Some were silent, processing. American soldiers felt rage toward Germans, not just German soldiers they were fighting, but German civilians who had enabled this through action or inaction. The simplistic moral framework that had sustained soldiers through combat, we are liberators, they are conquerors, became more complicated. Germans were also victims, also oppressed by Nazism, but they were also complicit, also participants in system that created places like Falkenau. Sorting through these moral complexities while still conducting combat operations was impossible. Most soldiers simplified by hating all Germans equally, at least temporarily. Moral nuance would come later, if at all. By April 21st, the 1st Infantry Division reached the Elbe River, approximately 100 kilometers west of Berlin. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. The Elbe would serve as demarcation line between Western Allied and Soviet zones of occupation. Orders came to halt at the Elbe, not to advance further. This created frustration among soldiers who wanted to push to Berlin, who felt that stopping short of Germany's capital was strategically questionable and psychologically unsatisfying. But strategic realities dictated the halt agreements with Soviets, required respecting occupation zones, and American commanders saw no reason to take casualties fighting for territory that would be surrendered to Soviets after German surrender anyway. On April 25th, American and Soviet patrols met at the Elbe, symbolically cutting Germany in half. Soldiers from both armies fraternized, briefly sharing vodka and cigarettes, marveling that they had survived, that the war was nearly over. The meeting was photographed extensively, became symbols of Allied cooperation. In reality, relations were cordial but not warm. American and Soviet soldiers looked at each other and saw very different wars. Americans had fought Germans in Western Europe for 3 years. Soviets had fought on Eastern Front for 4 years, with casualties that dwarfed American losses. Each side believed their sacrifices were greater, their contributions more significant. These tensions would define post-war Europe, but in April 1945, they were subsumed by relief that Germany was finished. The final weeks of April and early May were strange for the 1st Infantry Division. Combat continued but felt purposeless. German forces knew the war was lost, yet some units kept fighting from discipline or ideology. Others surrendered in mass. Entire battalions giving up without resistance. The division advanced through Czechoslovakia, liberating territory that would eventually be Soviet-controlled but was temporarily in American hands. Civilians in Czech towns welcomed Americans as liberators, with celebrations that recalled August 1944 in France: flowers, wine, tearful gratitude. These celebrations felt hollow to soldiers who knew American forces would withdraw and Czechs would live under Soviet domination, but they accepted the gratitude, participated in celebrations, allowed themselves brief moments of feeling like heroes rather than survivors. The division was in Czechoslovakia, approaching the pre-war German-Czech border, when news arrived on May 7th that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Soldiers who had fought for 3 years, who had survived when thousands of comrades hadn't, who had seen humanity at its worst and occasionally at its best, were free. They had done what they set out to do, they had won, and they were alive. The relief was overwhelming. So was the guilt of surviving when so many hadn't. So was the uncertainty of what came next. For 3 years, their purpose had been simple: fight, survive, accomplish missions. Now that purpose was gone. What did surviving mean? What did victory cost? Were they still soldiers? Or had they become something else, ghosts who had survived their own deaths, walking through a world that couldn't understand what they had experienced? These questions wouldn't be answered quickly. But on May 7th, 1945, they didn't matter. The war was over. They had survived. For that moment, that was enough. May 8th, 1945, Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The 1st Infantry Division received official word that Germany had surrendered unconditionally at 0241 hours Central European Time. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, had arrived. Across England and America, populations celebrated with parades, dancing, public drunkenness, euphoric relief that years of sacrifice had finally ended. In Pilsen, the division's reaction was muted. Men who had survived 3 years of combat didn't celebrate the way civilians did. Some drank, but quietly. Some wept, releasing emotions they had suppressed for years. Some sat in silence, processing what it meant that they would not die in combat, that friends who had died hadn't died for nothing, that the impossible task they had been given was complete. Czech civilians celebrated around them, treating American soldiers as heroes, offering food and alcohol and gratitude. The soldiers accepted graciously but couldn't fully participate in celebration. They were exhausted beyond physical tiredness, soul exhausted, the kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't cure. They needed time to process what they had experienced, to begin healing psychological wounds that would take decades to scar over. Instead, they received new orders. The division would become part of occupation force, maintaining order in defeated Germany, preventing resistance movements, enforcing Allied policies. The war was over. Their service was not. The statistics of the 1st Infantry Division's World War II service were grim cataloguing of human cost. Total casualties from November 1942 through May 1945, 21,023. Killed in action, approximately 4,280. Wounded, over 16,000. Missing or captured, the remainder. These numbers represented individuals, privates who had enlisted to escape depression poverty, officers who had seen military service as career opportunity, draftees who had been pulled from civilian life by lottery. Each casualty had family, parents who received telegrams, wives who became widows, children who grew up without fathers. The division had participated in 9 major campaigns: Algeria, French Morocco, Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Central Europe, Czechoslovakia. 440 consecutive days in active combat, more than any other American division in European theatre. The division's battle streamers would list famous engagements: Omaha Beach, Aachen, Hürtgen Forest, Battle of the Bulge. Behind each streamer were thousands of personal tragedies that no battle honour could adequately commemorate. 4 soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division received the Medal of Honor during World War II operations, the highest military decoration for valour. Technical Sergeant Carlton Barrett earned his posthumously for actions on Normandy beaches, reorganising scattered troops and leading attacks against German positions until he was killed. Private First Class Gino Merli earned his for holding defensive position in Belgium during September 1944, fighting alone through the night, protecting his wounded squad leader, killing dozens of German soldiers attempting to overrun his position. First Lieutenant Joseph Schaefer earned his posthumously for leading tanks and infantry against fortified German positions in Stolberg, Germany, refusing evacuation after being wounded, dying while inspiring his men to continue attacking. Private First Class George Turner earned his posthumously for actions in northern France, where he provided covering fire for his squad's withdrawal, staying in position until killed to allow others to escape. These four represented the thousands of acts of courage, sacrifice, and devotion to duty that characterized the division's service. Most acts of valor went unrecognized. Soldiers died before anyone could document what they had done, or their actions occurred in chaos where accurate reporting was impossible, or they survived but never spoke of what they had experienced because it seemed normal within context of combat. The occupation of Germany beginning in May 1945 presented the 1st Infantry Division with missions entirely different from combat operations. They were tasked with maintaining order in defeated Germany, preventing insurgent activity, processing German prisoners of war, managing displaced persons, and enforcing denazification policies. These missions required different skills than combat political judgment, cultural sensitivity, administrative capability. The division's aggressive combat culture was poorly suited for occupation duties. Soldiers trained to kill enemies now had to police populations that included former enemies. The division's reputation for combat effectiveness meant nothing in occupation context. Success was measured not in territory captured or enemies killed, but in maintaining order, preventing violence, establishing functional civil administration. This transition was difficult for many soldiers. They had defined themselves through combat competence. Now that combat had ended, their identities became uncertain. Who were they, if not warriors? What did it mean to be a 1st Division soldier in peacetime? These questions affected different soldiers differently. Some adapted well, finding satisfaction in reconstruction and civil affairs. Others struggled, missing the clarity that combat provided, even while recognizing that missing combat was psychologically disturbing. The fraternization policy prohibiting American soldiers from social contact with German civilians created significant problems during occupation. The policy was intended to prevent Americans from sympathizing with Germans, from forgetting that Germany had started the war and committed atrocities, but the policy was unenforceable and possibly unwise. Soldiers who were garrisoned in German towns necessarily interacted with German civilians, buying goods, using services, simply sharing space. Many German women sought relationships with American soldiers, whether from genuine attraction, from pragmatic need for protection and resources, or from both. American soldiers, young men who had been deprived of female company for years, were receptive to these advances. The official policy said no fraternization. Reality was that fraternization occurred constantly and punishing it was impossible. Officers largely ignored violations unless they became problematic. This created a situation where official policy and actual practice diverged completely. Everyone knew the rules, everyone ignored them, everyone understood that enforcement was selective. The hypocrisy bothered some soldiers and officers. Others saw it as pragmatic acceptance of human nature. Asterisk, asterisk. The point system determining who would be sent home and who would remain in occupation force, asterisk, asterisk, created new tensions within the division. Soldiers with high point totals, calculated based on time in service, time overseas, combat decorations, and dependence at home, were eligible for early demobilization. Soldiers with low point totals would remain in occupation force indefinitely. The system was rational in principle, reward those who had served longest, reunite families, maintain experienced force for occupation duties. In practice, it fragmented units and created resentment. Veterans who had survived North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and everything after watched as some comrades went home while others remained. Men who had fought together for years separated, often never to see each other again. The bonds formed in combat relationships deeper than peacetime friendships because they were forged in shared trauma were severed by administrative decisions. Some soldiers who stayed resented those who left. Some who left felt guilty about abandoning comrades. The emotional complexity of demobilization exceeded anything military bureaucracy was equipped to handle. The result was that the division's dissolution happened gradually and painfully, units losing veterans continuously while absorbing replacements who had no combat experience and no connection to the division's history. October 1945, first large contingents of 1st Infantry Division veterans departed Europe, sailing from Le Havre, France, to New York. The ships that carried them were converted troop transports, the same type of vessels that had brought them to Europe years earlier. The journey took a week. Soldiers spent the time processing what they had experienced and trying to imagine return to civilian life. Many worried about adjustment. How could they explain to families what they had done, what they had seen, what they had become? Others worried about employment. Would jobs be available for returning soldiers, or would they face depression conditions again? Still others worried about nothing in particular, just felt generalized anxiety that combat's end hadn't relieved. Some soldiers discussed plans, education under GI Bill, starting businesses, buying homes. These discussions were tentative, as if planning futures meant acknowledging they had survived when friends hadn't. The Atlantic crossing was subdued. These were not victorious troops returning in triumph. These were exhausted men going home to lives they had left years earlier, uncertain whether they still fit into those lives or whether war had changed them too fundamentally. The reception in New York Harbor repeated the scenes from 1918 when the division returned from World War I crowds, tugboat horns, bands playing, but individual soldiers' experiences were often anticlimactic. After being processed through reception centers, most were given train tickets to hometowns and told to report to demobilization centers for final discharge processing. The journey from combat in Europe to living room in hometown America took days, sometimes only a week. The psychological transition should have taken months or years. Men who had been killing enemies on Tuesday were expected to be normal civilians by the following Tuesday. Some managed the transition through compartmentalization. What happened in war stayed in war. Civilian life was different sphere. Others struggled, finding civilian life incomprehensible after years where survival was the only metric that mattered. Still others found that family and friends couldn't understand what they had experienced, that attempts to explain combat resulted in awkwardness or disbelief or horror. Many simply stopped trying to explain. They put away uniforms, put away memories, and tried to build lives as if the war had been brief interruption rather than defining experience of their youth. The 1st Infantry Division itself remained in Germany as occupation force, its designation and traditions continuing even as personnel changed. The division that occupied Germany in 1946 bore little resemblance to the division that had landed at Omaha Beach. Most combat veterans had been demobilized. Replacements were soldiers who had joined after VE Day, who had no combat experience, who wore the big red 1 patch without having earned it through shared trauma. The division's institutional knowledge survived in scattered officers and NCOs, who remained in unit histories and battle streamers, in traditions maintained through ceremony and training. But the human connections that had made the division more than organizational chart were severed. New soldiers knew about Omaha Beach and Aachen and the Hurtgen Forest from history, not memory. They respected what their predecessors had accomplished without fully understanding what it had cost. This was normal and necessary. Military units outlive the soldiers who compose them, but it meant that the division's World War II experience existed in 2 forms: the living memory of survivors who scattered across America and never fully shared what they had experienced, and the institutional memory preserved in division histories that recorded accomplishments without capturing the human cost. For the soldiers who survived and came home, World War II remained the central experience of their lives, even decades later. Most adapted, successfully used GI Bill for education, found employment, married, raised families, built comfortable middle-class lives, but combat never left them completely. Some had nightmares for years, waking terrified, reliving battles they thought they had processed. Some had physical symptoms, hearing certain sounds caused panic responses, seeing certain images triggered flashbacks, stress produced physical illness. Some struggled with alcohol or became isolated or had difficulty maintaining relationships because emotional intimacy required vulnerability they couldn't risk after learning that caring about people meant grieving their loss. Others appeared completely normal, successful in careers and family life, while carrying internal wounds they never disclosed. Still others found meaning in their service, joined veterans organizations, maintained contact with surviving comrades, constructed narratives that made sense of what they had experienced. There was no single way to be a 1st Division veteran, no single way to process having survived when thousands hadn't, no single meaning to extract from experience that had been primarily chaos and suffering, punctuated by brief moments of purpose and camaraderie. But they all shared one thing: they had been part of something larger than themselves, had accomplished something significant, had proven they could endure what they thought would destroy them. That knowledge sustained them through whatever came after. They were 1st Division soldiers. They had been first to fight, first to land on hostile shores, first to enter Germany, first to prove that American soldiers could match any enemy. That identity never left them. It was earned through sacrifice no peace could erase. 2019, Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia. Section 60 contains rows of white marble headstones that stretch toward the horizon with geometric precision. Each stone marks a soldier, each soldier represents a family, each family carries a story that statistics cannot capture. Among these stones are hundreds from the 1st Infantry Division men who died at Omaha Beach in the Huebner forest during the Battle of the Bulge, in a dozen forgotten skirmishes whose names appear in no history books. A researcher walks among these graves with a notebook documenting patterns. He is compiling data on division casualty rates, comparing the 1st Infantry Division's losses against other American divisions that fought in Europe. The numbers reveal something disturbing. The Big Red One's casualty rate exceeded most other divisions by significant margins. 21,023 total casualties from November 1942 through May 1945, over 4,000 killed. This represented approximately 150% turnover. The division was completely replaced once, then half replaced again. Some soldiers were wounded and returned multiple times. The researcher pauses at a headstone marking a private who died in March 1945, 2 months before war's end. The stone provides name, rank, dates. It doesn't explain why this soldier died or what his death accomplished or whether the mission that killed him was necessary. Statistics never do, but the patterns they reveal raise questions that haunt anyone who studies them carefully. Comparison with other divisions makes the 1st Infantry Division's experience starkly clear. The 29th Infantry Division, which landed alongside the 1st at Omaha Beach, suffered approximately 13,000 casualties over similar time frame, significantly less despite comparable combat exposure. The 4th Infantry Division, which fought from Utah Beach through the end of war, took approximately 15,000 casualties. The 82nd Airborne Division, elite paratroopers who fought in some of war's hardest battles, lost approximately 12,000. The 1st Infantry Division's 21,000 casualties exceeded these by 40 to 75%. Why? The answer lies in assignment patterns. The 1st Division participated in 9 major campaigns, more than most divisions. They were committed to combat earlier and remained in combat longer. They received the most difficult missions more frequently. When American commanders needed a division for critical operations, they chose the Big Red One because experience suggested they would succeed. This created a reinforcing cycle. Success earned harder missions. Harder missions created more casualties. Casualties required replacements. Replacements needed training that only combat could provide. Combat created more casualties. The division was being consumed by its own competence, destroyed by institutional reputation that made them simultaneously valuable and expendable. Individual soldiers experienced this pattern as random cruelty. Private James Morrison landed at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, was wounded by shrapnel on June 20th, evacuated to England, returned to his unit in August, fought through France and Belgium without additional injury, was wounded again by artillery fire in the Huebner forest in November, evacuated again, returned in January 1945, and was killed by a mine in Germany on March 14th. His service record shows 6 months of actual combat time spread over 9 months, punctuated by wounds and hospitalizations. He was wounded twice, killed once, at age 22. His family received a telegram in late March, a letter from his company commander in April, describing how Morrison died quickly, painlessly, the kind of lies officers told families because truth was too terrible, and his personal effects. Several months later, Morrison's story was common. Soldiers who were wounded and survived often returned to the same unit, the same combat zone, the same dangers that had wounded them initially. The replacement system treated soldiers as interchangeable parts: wound one, repair, return to service. This was efficient from institutional perspective, but psychologically devastating for individuals who survived initial wounds, only to be sent back into situations where they would likely be wounded or killed again. The question of whether this utilization pattern was ethical haunts post-war analysis. American military doctrine emphasized rotating divisions through combat and rest cycles, preventing units from becoming combat ineffective through accumulated casualties and exhaustion. In practice, this doctrine was inconsistently applied. Some divisions received extended rest periods after major operations. Others, particularly elite or experienced divisions like the 1st Infantry Division, remained in combat continuously because commanders believed they were too valuable to rest. This created a situation where the best divisions were destroyed through overuse, while less capable divisions remained intact through underutilization. From purely military perspective, the pattern made sense: use your best units for your hardest missions. From human perspective, it was sacrifice of specific soldiers for institutional efficiency. The soldiers who bore this cost had volunteered or been drafted to serve their country, not to be consumed disproportionately because they happened to be assigned to an elite division. Whether commanders owed them more equitable distribution of risk remains debated by military historians and ethicists. The soldiers themselves rarely discussed it. They did their jobs, accepted their missions, and survived or didn't based on factors mostly beyond their control. Post-war studies examining combat effectiveness and casualty rates revealed patterns that military organizations prefer not to acknowledge. Units with highest casualty rates often had poorest combat effectiveness toward the end of their service, despite having most experience. The reason was psychological accumulated trauma eventually exceeded human capacity to cope. Soldiers who survived multiple battles often became cautious to the point of ineffectiveness, or reckless to the point of suicidal, or simply stopped functioning emotionally. Combat effectiveness requires balance between caution and aggression, calculation and instinct. Soldiers who had seen too much combat lost that balance. They became unpredictable, might freeze under fire that earlier wouldn't have troubled them, or might take unnecessary risks because they stopped caring about survival. The 1st Infantry Division maintained combat effectiveness longer than most units, but by late 1944, even they showed signs of psychological breakdown. Herkenforest casualties included unprecedented numbers of psychiatric evacuations. Officers reported that soldiers who had performed excellently in previous campaigns were struggling with basic tasks. This wasn't cowardice or malingering, it was human limitation. Everyone breaks eventually. The question is whether military organizations acknowledge this limitation and plan accordingly, or whether they use soldiers until breaking point and then blame individuals for failing. The replacement system itself contributed to casualty rates in ways rarely acknowledged. Replacement soldiers, men who joined units to replace casualties, died at significantly higher rates than soldiers who had trained with units from the beginning. The reasons were straightforward. Replacements lacked social bonds with squad mates, making them less integrated into units' informal communication and protection networks. They lacked unit-specific knowledge about how things were done, what dangers to watch for, who to trust. They lacked the combat experience that taught survival skills no training could replicate. Most critically, they lacked time to develop the trust that made experienced soldiers protect each other instinctively. Veteran soldiers sometimes treated replacements with deliberate coldness, refusing to learn their names until they survived long enough to prove they wouldn't immediately become casualties, requiring emotional processing. This coldness was self-protection. Caring about people who would likely die soon was psychologically unbearable. But it also meant replacements entered combat without the social support systems that helped veterans survive. The result was that replacements died disproportionately, often within days or weeks of joining units. Their deaths barely registered in unit consciousness. They were gone before anyone knew them, but they registered in families who received telegrams about sons who had been killed before their letters home arrived, who died among strangers who didn't mourn them because they hadn't lived long enough to matter. Asterisk, asterisk. The arithmetic of war, the cold calculation of casualties against objectives, asterisk, asterisk, assumes casualties are abstract numbers rather than specific people. At division headquarters, casualty reports listed killed, wounded, missing by category. Officers assessed whether objectives had been achieved and whether casualty rates were acceptable given strategic value gained. This assessment was necessary. Wars cannot be fought without accepting that soldiers will die, and decisions about whether operations should continue require weighing costs against benefits. But the process dehumanized casualties in ways that created moral distance between decision makers and consequences. Officers who ordered attacks that resulted in hundreds of casualties rarely saw the bodies, rarely witnessed the dying, rarely had to write individual letters to families explaining how their sons died. This distance was necessary for military effectiveness officers who personally mourned every casualty would be paralyzed. But it also enabled decisions that might have been different if decision makers bore personal witness to consequences. The 1st Infantry Division's casualties were acceptable from strategic perspective because the division accomplished its missions. Whether they were acceptable from moral perspective depends on whether one prioritizes institutional effectiveness or individual dignity. There is no objective answer. There is only the weight of 21,000 casualties and the question of whether their sacrifice could have been reduced without compromising war effort. Modern analysis using statistical methods unavailable during the war reveals patterns about survival and death in combat that contradict conventional wisdom. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, most combat deaths resulted not from dramatic firefights but from artillery and mortar fire, impersonal killing by unseen enemies, firing from distant positions. Approximately 60% of American combat casualties in European theatre resulted from explosive devices, artillery shells, mortar rounds, mines, grenades. Only 25% resulted from small arms fire. The remaining 15% came from accidents, disease, and miscellaneous causes. This distribution meant survival often depended more on luck than skill. A soldier could do everything correctly, maintain proper spacing, use cover effectively, follow tactical doctrine, and still die because an artillery shell happened to land nearby. This randomness was psychologically corrosive. Soldiers could accept death as consequence of poor decisions or inadequate training. Accepting death as random chance, where survival depended primarily on not being in wrong place at wrong moment, was harder. It made superstition, common lucky charms, rituals, beliefs that certain behaviors would protect against randomness. Rationally, soldiers knew these were meaningless. Psychologically, they needed to believe they had some control over their fates. The question that haunts anyone who studies the 1st Infantry Division's World War II experience is whether being elite was worth the cost. The division accomplished every mission assigned. They established combat reputation that endured through subsequent decades. They proved American soldiers could match or exceed any enemy. These accomplishments were significant and probably shortened the war, saving lives overall. But the cost fell disproportionately on soldiers who happened to be assigned to the Big Red One rather than other divisions. Was this fair? Military effectiveness doesn't require fairness, it requires accomplishing missions. But soldiers who volunteer for military service accept risk of death in service of their country, not risk of disproportionate sacrifice, because they were assigned to a unit whose reputation made them more expendable than soldiers in less accomplished units. The ethical tension is unresolvable. Commanders needed elite units for critical missions. Elite units became elite through combat experience. Combat experience required casualties. Casualties destroyed the soldiers who created the elite reputation. The cycle was inherent to military operations and probably unavoidable, but that doesn't make it just. It makes it tragic. And the tragedy belongs not to abstract institutions, but to specific soldiers whose names are recorded on headstones in Arlington and in military cemeteries across Europe. Soldiers who died because they were good at their jobs and their competence made them valuable enough to be used until they were destroyed. 21,023 casualties. The number is large enough to be abstract, small enough to be imaginable. Picture a football stadium filled to 1/3 capacity. Picture every person there wearing a 1st Infantry Division patch. Picture them vanishing not all at once, but gradually over 3 years until the stadium is mostly empty and the remaining soldiers are surrounded by ghosts of those who didn't survive. That's what the division's casualty rate represented. Not statistics, not acceptable losses. People, young men mostly, who had lives they wanted to live, families who waited for them, futures they imagined. They gave those futures to accomplish missions that seemed necessary at the time and remain historically significant in retrospect. Whether the exchange was worth it depends on perspective. From strategic perspective, absolutely, the 1st Infantry Division's service contributed significantly to Allied victory. From individual perspective, impossible to answer. Soldiers who died cannot be consulted about whether their deaths were worthwhile, and survivors carry complex feelings about having lived when friends didn't. The only certainty is that the cost was real, was measured in specific human lives rather than abstract numbers, and that the burden of that cost was distributed unevenly across the American military, falling disproportionately on soldiers who wore the Big Red One and carried its legacy. They were first to fight, first to bleed, first to prove what American soldiers could accomplish. And they paid for that distinction with casualties that exceeded most other divisions by margins that statistical analysis reveals, but only personal stories can make comprehensible. The arithmetic of war reduces them to numbers. Memory insists they were more. March 1943, North Africa. Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, assembled for a company photograph outside their bivouac near Gafsa, Tunisia. 180 men, arranged in rows, enlisted soldiers kneeling in front, NCOs standing behind them, officers in the centre back row. They had survived the North Africa campaign's hardest battles, had proven themselves in combat, and believed they were invincible in the way young men who survive danger often do. The photographer, a Signal Corps specialist, positioned his camera and called for attention. 180 faces looked at the lens, some smiling, some serious, all young. The oldest was the company commander, a captain of 28. Most were between 19 and 23. They wore uniforms faded by sun and sand, carried weapons they had learned to trust, displayed confidence that came from having faced death and survived. The photograph took seconds to capture. It would take 2 years to reveal its full meaning, because that photograph documented not a moment but a countdown. Most of these men would be dead, wounded, or psychologically destroyed before Germany surrendered. The photograph captured them at their peak, experienced enough to be effective, not yet broken by accumulated trauma. It froze a moment that would never return. Follow specific faces in that photograph through the months that followed. Front row, third from left. Private Robert Castellano, age 20, from Philadelphia. Enlisted January 1942, deployed to North Africa in November, survived Tunisia, landed at Guettar in Sicily, fought through to Palermo, killed by mortar fire on July 28, 1943, during assault on Troina. He had been in combat 8 months. His body was recovered and eventually buried in Sicily, Rome, American Cemetery. His mother received notification in September. She kept his photograph on her mantle for the rest of her life, never quite accepting that he wouldn't return. Middle row, center, Sergeant Frank Kowalski, age 24, from Chicago. Career soldier who enlisted in 1939, became squad leader through competence and longevity. Survived Sicily, landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, fought through hedgerows, wounded by artillery on July 16, 1944, evacuated to England, returned to unit in September, killed in Hurtgen Forest on November 8, 1944, when tree bursts sent wood shrapnel through his chest. He had survived 19 months of combat. His squad members barely had time to mourn before his replacement arrived. Back row, right side, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, age 23, from Boston, college graduate, officer candidate school, commissioned in 1942. Led platoon through Sicily and Normandy with minimal casualties, earning reputation for caution that saved lives. Promoted to first lieutenant in August 1944, wounded at Aachen in October, refused evacuation, continued commanding despite injuries. Killed in Hurtgen Forest on November 22nd during the Maraude assault, shot by sniper while coordinating with artillery observer. His platoon sergeant wrote his family describing Harrison as best officer he had served under, someone who cared about his men and died trying to protect them. Whether this made his death more or less tragic remains unanswerable. Front row, far right, Private Joseph Martinez, age 19, from Texas. Drafted in 1942, joined division in North Africa as replacement after Kasserine Pass, survived Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, France. Wounded slightly multiple times, but never seriously enough for evacuation. Fought through Aachen and survived. Entered Hurtgen Forest in October. Evacuated in November with combat exhaustion, couldn't stop shaking, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. Spent 3 months in hospital, diagnosed with what would later be called PTSD. Never returned to combat. Survived the war but struggled with nightmares and depression for decades. He lived to age 78 but told his children, the boy in that photograph died in the Hurtgen, even if his body survived. Middle row, left side, Corporal David O'Brien, age 22, from New York. Assistant squad leader, known for dark humour that sustained morale during hardest times. Survived North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, France, Belgium. Fought at Aachen and survived. Survived Hurtgen Forest against odds. Survived Battle of the Bulge. Wounded in Germany in March 1945 by mine that cost him his left leg below the knee. Evacuated, treated, eventually sent home. Adjusted to prosthetic leg. Used GI Bill to attend college. Became accountant, married, raised 3 children. Rarely spoke about the war except with other veterans. Attended division reunions religiously for 50 years. maintaining connections with survivors because they were the only people who understood what he had experienced. He lived to age 91, longer than most of his company mates, and carried guilt about surviving until the day he died. Front row, second from right, Private William Chen, age 21, from California. First-generation Chinese-American, enlisted to prove loyalty and patriotism despite discrimination at home. Excellent soldier, respected by squad mates, proved himself repeatedly, survived Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, killed at Aachen on October 18, 1944, during house-to-house fighting. His family received notification and a letter from his company commander praising his service. They framed both in their living room alongside his portrait evidence that their son had died as an American soldier defending American values. His younger brother enlisted in 1945 and served in occupation forces, partially to honor his brother's sacrifice. By June 1944, 15 months after the photograph was taken, approximately 30 soldiers from the original 180 remained with the company unwounded and psychologically intact. Sicily had cost approximately 40 casualties. Normandy and the hedgerow fighting cost another 70. The remaining soldiers were distributed among wounded, still hospitalized, evacuated with combat exhaustion, or dead. The company had been rebuilt multiple times with replacement troops who had not been in the original photograph, who had no connection to the unit's North Africa experience, who were simply names filling vacancies in the roster. By December 1944, after Aachen and the Huebner forest, fewer than 15 original company members remained. By war's end, in May 1945, approximately 10 soldiers from that March 1943 photograph were still with the unit, still physically capable of combat, still psychologically functional enough to continue serving. 170 men from the photograph had become casualties or had been transferred. This 94% casualty rate exceeded even the division's average and reflected the particular horror of rifle company service, where exposure to danger was constant and protection was minimal. The photograph itself became artifact of loss rather than victory. After the war, surviving company members tried to identify everyone in the photo and document what happened to them. They created a list name, hometown, fate. Killed in action appeared most frequently. Wounded, evacuated appeared often. Survived appeared rarely. The project took years because many soldiers had lost contact, some had changed names, some refused to participate because remembering was too painful. Eventually, they compiled a mostly complete roster. The document showed patterns. Soldiers who joined the company before North Africa had slightly higher survival rates than replacements who joined later. The original members had learned survival skills through experience that replacements never had time to develop. Officers and NCOs died at higher rates than enlisted men. Leadership visibility made them targets. Soldiers in certain roles, scouts, machine gunners, forward observers, died at catastrophic rates because their roles required exposure. The randomness that governed survival was overlaid with structural factors that made some positions inherently more dangerous. But ultimately, survival came down to luck. Good soldiers died, bad soldiers survived. Heroes died, cowards survived. The universe was indifferent to virtue or cowardice. Artillery shells killed whoever happened to be nearby. Snipers shot whoever exposed themselves. Mines exploded under whoever stepped on them. The photograph captured men before they learned this lesson completely, when they still believed skill and courage mattered more than luck. Individual stories behind the faces reveal the human cost that statistics abstract. Private Michael O'Connor, age 20, center of front row, survived North Africa and Sicily but was killed on Omaha Beach, shot while helping a wounded soldier to cover. His body was never recovered, listed as missing in action, eventually declared dead. His family held a memorial service without remains to bury. His mother spent the rest of her life wondering if somehow he had survived, been captured, might still return. Sergeant James Peterson, age 25, right side of middle row, survived Normandy but was captured during Huebner Forest when his squad was overrun. Spent 6 months in German POW camp, survived starvation and disease, was liberated by Russian forces in April 1945, returned home in June. He weighed 110 pounds when liberated, down from 170 at capture. Never fully recovered his health, died in 1963 from complications related to malnutrition in the camp. His children grew up with a father who was physically present but emotionally absent, damaged by experiences he could never articulate. Private Anthony Garcia, age 19, left side of front row, was wounded 3 separate times, minor wounds that didn't require evacuation, treated by medics, and returned to duty within days. Survived the entire war, came home intact physically, struggled with guilt about surviving when friends hadn't, never used GI Bill, worked factory jobs, drank heavily, died in 1978 from cirrhosis at age 54. His family knew the war killed him, even if his death certificate listed liver disease. The photograph's most haunting aspect is how ordinary these men appear. They don't look like heroes or victims. They look like the young men. They were boys, really, who had been shaped by depression childhoods, who had enlisted or been drafted into military service, who found themselves in North Africa fighting veteran German troops with inadequate training and equipment. They learned on the job, survived through luck and mutual support, became competent soldiers through necessity. The photograph captured them at that moment of transformation, no longer civilians, not yet casualties, simply soldiers doing their jobs. Most wouldn't have described themselves as heroes. Most would have said they were just trying to survive, trying to help their friends survive, trying to accomplish missions so they could go home. The heroism, if it existed, was in continuing to function despite fear, despite losses, despite exhaustion that accumulated over months until consciousness became a form of endurance. They kept going because stopping wasn't an option, because their squad mates depended on them, because military discipline and personal pride created behavioral patterns that persisted even when emotional foundations collapsed. The photograph doesn't show this interior experience. It shows young men in uniforms looking at a camera, but behind those faces were stories of courage and terror, competence and confusion, survival and loss that no photograph could capture completely. By 2019, no one from that photograph remained alive. The last survivor died in 2017 at age 94. His obituary mentioned his service with the 1st Infantry Division, his 3 Purple Hearts, his Bronze Star. It didn't mention the nightmares that plagued him for 70 years, the moments when sounds or smells triggered flashbacks to combat, the way he flinched when cars backfired. It didn't mention that he told his children never to let their children enlist, that the medals meant nothing compared to the friends he lost, that he survived, but parts of him died in North Africa and Sicily and Normandy and never recovered. Those details died with him. What remains is the photograph, 180 faces captured in March 1943, most of whom would be dead within 2 years, all of whom are dead now. The photograph is displayed in the 1st Infantry Division Museum, a document of what these soldiers looked like before the war consumed them. Visitors see young men in uniform and understand abstractly that most died in combat. But they can't see the specific moments. Castellano dying instantly from mortar fire, Kowalski bleeding out in the Huebner forest, Harrison killed by a sniper, Chen trapped in Aachen rubble that transformed these faces from living people to historical casualties. The photograph freezes them at their peak. Memory insists they deserved better than the fates they received. History records that they did their duty. Neither perspective brings them back. They remain faces in a photograph. Young men who went to war and mostly didn't return, whose sacrifices contributed to victory, and whose individual stories mostly vanished when they died. The photograph is all that remains evidence that they existed, that they served, that they mattered to someone even if only briefly. 1965, Fort Riley, Kansas. Young soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division prepared for deployment to Vietnam, the first major American ground combat unit sent to Southeast Asia. They wore the same Big Red 1 patch their grandfathers had worn in World War II, carried the same institutional pride, believed they were joining a legacy of excellence. Officers addressed them in formations, reminding them of division history, North Africa, Sicily, Omaha Beach, the liberation of Europe. The message was clear. You are joining something larger than yourselves, something with traditions worth preserving, something that demands excellence. The soldiers listened with appropriate solemnity, understanding they were being entrusted with a reputation built through decades of sacrifice. Most were volunteers or early draftees, motivated by patriotism or adventure or simple duty. They looked forward to proving themselves, to adding their own chapter to division history. They didn't understand yet that carrying legacy means carrying burden, that the Big Red One's reputation for accomplishing impossible missions meant they would be assigned those missions repeatedly. That institutional pride could become institutional curse. That excellence was punished with harder assignments until units broke. They would learn these lessons in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, would discover that modern insurgency warfare differed fundamentally from World War II conventional combat, would find that courage and competence sometimes weren't sufficient for victory. But in 1965, standing in formation at Fort Riley, they believed in themselves, in their division, in their mission. That belief would sustain them initially and haunt them eventually. The 1st Infantry Division fought in Vietnam from 1965 to 1970, longer than they fought in World War II, accumulating over 21,000 casualties, again eerily similar to World War II totals. The Vietnam War was different in every way that mattered. No front lines, no clear objectives, no obvious enemy, no home front support, no sense of progress toward victory. Soldiers patrolled jungles looking for enemies who disappeared into civilian populations, fought battles that secured territory temporarily but permanently, took casualties for objectives that were abandoned days later. The division's World War II reputation meant nothing to Vietnamese insurgents who hadn't heard of Omaha Beach and wouldn't have cared if they had. American firepower superiority meant little against enemies who avoided conventional combat and attacked through ambush, mines, and booby traps. The Big Red One's aggressive combat culture, valuable in World War II, became problematic in Vietnam, where aggression sometimes created more enemies than it killed. By 1968, after Tet Offensive, many soldiers questioned whether the war was winnable, whether their sacrifices meant anything, whether carrying the division's legacy was worth the cost. Some maintained belief in mission, others became cynical or despondent. Still others simply counted days until rotation home, focusing on personal survival rather than mission accomplishment. The division's Vietnam experience was complicated, controversial, and left scars on soldiers and institutions that took decades to heal. 2004, Iraq. The 1st Infantry Division deployed to Iraq for stability operations, their designation first to fight, taking on new meaning in the global war on terrorism. They conducted counterinsurgency operations, trained Iraqi security forces, hunted terrorists, built infrastructure. The mission was nation-building disguised as combat operations, requiring skills that traditional combat training didn't emphasize. Soldiers who had joined the Big Red One, expecting to repeat their grandfather's experiences, found themselves doing police work in a foreign country where cultural misunderstandings could escalate into firefights. The division adapted, they always adapted, institutional flexibility being one of their strengths, but adaptation cost lives and psychological health. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, became primary threat, killing soldiers who couldn't identify danger until too late. Suicide bombers attacked checkpoints and convoys. Snipers targeted patrols. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, embedded in civilian populations, indistinguishable until they attacked. Soldiers developed paranoia that bordered on necessary. Everyone was potential threat, every object potential bomb, every interaction potential ambush. This mindset was essential for survival but corrosive to humanity. Many soldiers came home from Iraq psychologically damaged in ways that wouldn't manifest for years. The pattern across a century of service reveals the cost of being elite. The 1st Infantry Division deployed to every major American conflict from World War I through Afghanistan, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Gulf War, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Their designation as first to fight was simultaneously honor and curse. They deployed early, fought hardest, took disproportionate casualties, received hardest missions. This pattern wasn't conspiracy or malice. Commanders naturally assigned critical missions to most experienced, capable units. But the result was that certain divisions, particularly the 1st Infantry Division, bore disproportionate burden. Soldiers who joined the Big Red One, thinking they were joining an elite unit, discovered they had joined an institution that would use them until they broke, then rebuild and repeat the process. The division's casualty rates across all conflicts exceeded most other divisions by significant margins. Whether this was acceptable cost of institutional excellence or systemic failure to distribute risk equitably remains debated. Military necessity required elite units. Elite units required combat experience. Combat experience required casualties. The cycle was inherent to military operations. But that doesn't make it just or dignified. It makes it tragic. Modern soldiers, carrying the Big Red One, patch face expectations shaped by history. When they deploy, they know they represent legacy, stretching back to 1917, that their actions reflect on thousands of soldiers who wore the patch before them, that failure means disgracing tradition, This creates pressure that enhances performance but damages psychological health. Soldiers internalize standards that may be unrealistic, judge themselves against heroes they've heard about but never met, feel they must prove themselves worthy of patch they wear. Some thrive under this pressure, finding meaning in connecting to something larger than themselves. Others crack, unable to reconcile human limitations with institutional expectations. Still others perform adequately but carry internal conflicts about whether they measure up to predecessors whose accomplishments have been mythologized beyond reality. The weight of history is real burden, physically light but psychologically heavy. Every mission carries not just immediate tactical requirements but symbolic significance. If 1st Division fails, it reflects on entire institutional legacy. This significance motivates but also crushes. Not everyone can bear the weight of being first. The division's museum at Cantigny, Illinois, preserves artifacts from over a century of service. World War I uniforms, World War II weapons, Vietnam equipment, Iraq vehicles, medals, battle streamers, photographs, documents. Walking through the museum creates a disorienting sense of time, collapsing soldiers from different eras, separated by decades, united by shared designation. A teenager's uniform from World War I hangs near body armor worn in Afghanistan, a rifle from Tunisia displayed beside a rifle from Fallujah. The technologies differ radically. The human experiences they represent share disturbing similarities: fear, exhaustion, loss, pride, trauma. The museum tells triumphant narrative about institutional excellence, emphasizing victories and heroism. But reading carefully between displays reveals the cost casualty rates, psychiatric evacuations, soldiers who survived physically but were broken psychologically. The museum honors service while sanitizing suffering, commemorates sacrifice while minimizing its magnitude. This is probably necessary. Full honesty about war's psychological costs would be unbearable for visitors and disrespectful to veterans who prefer their service be remembered with dignity rather than trauma. But sanitization creates gap between institutional memory and lived experience, between how the division is remembered and what soldiers actually endured. Reunions of 1st Division veterans reveal both connection and disconnection across generations. World War II veterans, those few who survived into their 90s, attended reunions with Vietnam veterans, Iraq veterans, Afghanistan veterans. They wore the same patch, belonged to the same institution, but fought entirely different wars. World War II veterans remembered conventional combat against identifiable enemies in service of clear objectives. Vietnam veterans remembered counterinsurgency warfare without front lines or obvious victory conditions. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans remembered counter-terrorism operations where enemies hid among civilians and missions changed repeatedly. They shared institutional identity but not experiential common ground. Some found commonality in the generic experiences of combat: fear, loss, camaraderie, bureaucracy. Others felt isolated, even among fellow division members, because their specific experiences were so different. The reunions served social function, maintaining connections, honoring dead, preserving institutional memory. But they also highlighted that the 1st Infantry Division wasn't single continuous entity, but rather designation that had been applied to many different organizations composed of different people fighting different wars under different conditions. What united them was primarily symbolic: the patch, the designation, the tradition of being first. Whether this symbolic unity was meaningful or merely commemorative varied by individual. The question of what the division's legacy means in 21st century is complicated by changing nature of warfare and American society. Modern military operations emphasize precision, minimizing casualties, achieving objectives through technology rather than mass. The World War II model, large divisions conducting sustained operations, accepting high casualties as necessary for strategic objectives, is obsolete. Modern 1st Infantry Division deploys in smaller formations, stays deployed shorter periods, uses technology to reduce risk. This is militarily sound and morally preferable. Why accept casualties if technology can reduce them? But it also means modern division members have fundamentally different experiences than World War II predecessors. They're not fighting the same way, not taking the same risks, not making the same sacrifices. Whether they can claim equivalent legacy is questionable. Some argue that service is service, that modern soldiers face different challenges but equivalent dangers. Others argue that comparing modern deployments to World War II diminishes World War II veteran sacrifices. There's no resolution to this debate because it involves subjective judgments about what constitutes meaningful service. What's clear is that the Big Red 1 designation means different things to different generations, and that gap will widen as World War II recedes further into history. Arlington National Cemetery contains entire sections dedicated to 1st Infantry Division casualties, hundreds of white headstones marked with the Big Red 1 insignia. Walking among these graves creates overwhelming sense of loss. Each stone represents not just individual soldier, but ripples of grief extending through families and communities. Parents who buried children, wives who buried husbands, children who grew up without fathers. The magnitude accumulates not just 4,000 World War II dead, but 4,000 instances of families destroyed, futures cancelled, potential unrealized. Some stones are visited regularly, flowers placed, flags planted, loved ones who maintain connection decades after death. Others are neglected, no living relatives remain. No one remembers who these soldiers were, beyond names and dates, carved in marble. Both types of graves represent equivalent service and sacrifice. Only time determines whether sacrifice is remembered or forgotten. The newer graves, Iraq and Afghanistan casualties, still receive regular visitors. Give it 50 years, and they'll be forgotten too, just names in records, evidence that once there were soldiers who served and died and mattered to someone. The pattern repeats across generations. The division continues. Individual soldiers come and go. Some are remembered, most are forgotten. But all contributed to institution that outlives them. The ultimate meaning of the 1st Infantry Division's World War II service resists simple interpretation. From a military perspective, the division was extraordinarily successful, accomplished every mission, maintained combat effectiveness longer than most units, contributed significantly to Allied victory. From individual perspective, the cost was catastrophic: 21,000 casualties, thousands dead, thousands more permanently damaged physically or psychologically. From historical perspective, their service was significant but not unique. They were one of many divisions that fought well, suffered heavily, and contributed to eventual victory. From moral perspective, their sacrifice demands respect, but also raises questions about whether military institutions adequately protect soldiers or whether they consume them in service of institutional objectives. All these perspectives are simultaneously true and inadequate. The Big Red Ones, World War II veterans, were heroes who accomplished extraordinary things under terrible conditions. They were also victims of military system that used them until they broke. They were professionals who took pride in their service. They were traumatized survivors who carried psychological wounds for decades. They were patriots who believed in their mission. They were cynics who learned that rhetoric about glory and honor rarely matched reality of combat. They were all of these things, and trying to reduce them to single narrative does violence to complexity of their experiences. What remains is memory increasingly distant, increasingly abstract, but still powerful. The 1st Infantry Division fought in World War II. They were first to fight, first to land on hostile shores, first to prove what American soldiers could accomplish. And they paid for that distinction with sacrifices that statistics measure, but only personal stories can make comprehensible. Their legacy isn't glory. It's endurance, the quiet, terrible endurance of men who kept going when everything said to stop, who survived when survival seemed impossible, who carried burdens that should have crushed them and somehow remained standing. That endurance, more than any victory, defines what it meant to wear the Big Red 1. It was honor, it was curse, it was identity, forged in suffering and preserved through memory. And now, decades after the last shots were fired, it remains carved in stone, recorded in archives, carried by soldiers who never knew the World War II veterans but wear their patch anyway. The shadow of the Big Red 1 stretches across a century, touching every soldier who wears the designation, reminding them they are part of something larger than themselves, something built on sacrifice they can honor but never fully repay. That is legacy. That is burden. That is what it means to be first.